who's Director General of Primary Care and Prevention from the Department of Health and Social Security. Warm welcome, Jonathan. You've been before us before, I think. Juliet Chua, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Juliet. You are the Senior Director General of Schools, so warm welcome to you. And you've been before us, I think, as well. And a particular welcome to Susan Acland-Hood, who is the Permanent Secretary at the Department of Health, Education and DFEE. You've appeared before us many times before, so a particularly warm welcome to you. And Alison Ismail, if I hope I pronounced your name correctly, you're the Senior Responsible Officer for SEN, so a lot of it falls on your lap.
That's correct. My last name's actually pronounced Ismail.
Ismail, right. Thank you. Right, I will try and get that right in future. And it's your first time before the committee,
yes.
So a very warm welcome to you, and we look forward to hearing from you as and when the questions come up. So thank you all very much for coming. So I now have to introduce this session, and this is the first session of the new Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 18th of November on the subject of support for children and young people with special educational needs. So we welcome Helen Hayes. Well, we don't, actually, because she's not here, but in spirit we welcome Helen Hayes, the Chair of the Education Select Committee, as a guest member of this inquiry. Guests from other committees are extremely useful because they have a lot of specialist knowledge. Helen will be back, but she's just had to go into Parliament for a statement, I think. Around 1.9 million children and young people in England are identified as having special educational needs. The Department for Education's SEN system aims to improve outcomes for these children and young people. While the Department for Education has increased high needs funding over the last decade, the system, sadly, is still not delivering better outcomes for children and young people. The NAO's report found that the SEN system is financially unsustainable without reform, with local authorities facing serious financial risks as a result. Families and children lack confidence in an adversarial system that is often falling short of statutory and quality expectations. So today, this new keen committee will question our witnesses on the overall performance of the system, the outcomes achieved for those with SEN, and what action is being taken to create a sustainable system. So without any further ado, I will pass on to the first question, who is myself, when I've got the right pieces of paper, and ask Miss Acland-Hood, if I may, and Jonathan Marron, what specific improvements would you expect to see for children to know that the SEN system is working effectively for them?
Thank you very much indeed. And I wanted to start by saying that all of us are here because we care profoundly about children with special educational needs and their parents, and we know the system is not working well enough and we want to change it. And I wanted to make that very clear at the outset. I also wanted to show appreciation and say thank you to teachers, to colleagues in local authorities up and down the country, and to others who work closely with children and young people and their parents every day to make the best offer that they possibly can in the current system. On the question of what we would see that would show us that the system was working, we look both at the kind of relatively obvious educational outcomes for children and young people with SEN, so all the way through the system, from those who are assessed as meeting a good level of development at age 5, all the way through the system. We look at outcomes for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. But we also look much more widely at well-being outcomes, at readiness for work, and there's a helpful set of expectations set out in the SEND Code of Practice, which says that all children and young people with SEND should be supported to develop independence, to contribute to their community, to develop positive friendships, to be as healthy as possible, and to be prepared for higher education or employment. And that links really closely to the mission-based approach that this government is taking, where for all children we look across a number of dimensions, thinking about giving every child the best possible start in life, every child achieving and thriving, giving people skills for opportunity and growth as they come through into the workforce, and an underpinning focus on family security looking both at child poverty and at safety. And there's a really important link there for children with special educational needs as well, because we see significant overlaps between children with special educational needs and those in contact with the children's social care system.
Well, thank you for that, Marron. I think on behalf of the committee, would echo our thanks to our very hard-working teachers up and down the country. We all visit a lot of schools. These people with special education needs and the HCP plans are some of the most vulnerable children in the land. So what we do here is really hopefully going to have a difference. So thank you for that remark. Can I just turn you to paragraph 7? And the headline of that paragraph on page 6 says, since 2019, there have been no consistent improvement in outcomes for children and young people with SEN. It says, and going down further in that paragraph, DFE is not achieving its ultimate ambition relating to what young people do after school. And the 2014 Act says it's intended to put children and parents at the heart of the system. But it's not, is it, Ms. Acland-Hood?
So if we look back at attainment outcomes for children and young people with SEND, we do see some improvement, and particularly over the last 10 years we see improvement. So in Key Stage 2 in 2015-16, 14% of all pupils with special educational needs were meeting the required standard. Fast forward to 23-24, and that is 21%. Similarly, if you look at those meeting the expected standard in the early years and foundation stage profile, you do see an improvement for children with special educational needs and disabilities. But as the NAO report points out, although again in each of those measures you have seen a small improvement year on year, this year on last year, as with a lot of other children in the system, there was a dip during the pandemic which we haven't fully recovered from. And you also still see issues in the attainment of children and young people with SEND as they go out after compulsory schooling in their employment rate. And there is still a significant gap in the employment rate between children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities and their peers. So there is still a lot more to do, I think. About 67% of parents of children with SEND in the state system feel that their child got the support they needed, but that means that somewhere around a third did not, and that's nowhere near good enough.
Oh, thank you. Could I ask you, please, Alison, Ismail, and turning really to that same paragraph, the next sentence in that paragraph, it says in 21-22, 69% of those with SEN stage 4 were in sustained education, apprenticeship and employment after leaving 16 to 18 to study, compared to 85% in mainstream schools, basically. So one of the things that we're concerned about is the sustainability of the system to look after people when they move from the world of school to college to work. And it doesn't seem to be working as well for those with special education needs as for those in mainstream schools. What are you doing about that?
So just to point out, first of all, that the overwhelming majority of children and young people with special educational needs are educated in mainstream schools. There are obviously some who are in special schools, including independent special schools, but overwhelmingly, though, up to about 80% or even slightly more are in mainstream. So in terms of measuring destinations, that will obviously include a large and quite heterogeneous group of young people, and that's probably really important in terms of understanding how they fare when they move on from education. But the Code of Practice does state very clearly that a key part of the SEN system should be about preparing those young people well in advance of transitions. And so, for example, in year 9, so around the age of 13 and 14, secondary schools should start to be thinking about the next destination for those children and young people. I think how we tend to look at it is in two ways. There are some measures that we take specifically to support children and young people with SEND into appropriate destinations for them when they move on from the education system, whether that's further education, training or employment. And our supported internships programme, which we described in last year's improvement plan, set out an ambition to offer supported internships to 4,500 young people. And that's a structured programme enabling young people with additional needs to be supported into a sustainable role in the workplace. But equally, in terms of making sure that that broad cohort of young people well equipped to go on to the next destination for them, lots of that will be about much earlier support. So whether that's early intervention in terms of picking up needs that might demonstrate themselves in the primary phase, making sure that curriculum's suitable and accessible for them, and other considerations like that. So really to close that gap, we think that we need to be focusing well ahead of that actual transition out of education.
Well, I totally agree with your sentiment about early intervention, and I'm sure other members of the committee will want to come back to that because it's a really important part of this whole story. How do you measure positive outcomes for children with SEN but beyond academic attainment? We've seen it throughout the NAA report how important things like autism and speech and those sorts of social difficulties. So it's not just about academic achievements. How are you measuring that?
I wasn't sure if Juliet or Susan would like to...
Juliet, yes, I'm very happy to bring you in on this.
To come in. As the NAO say in the report, actually the term special educational needs is a broad term, and it reflects a tremendous diversity of different primary need amongst children and young people who are identified. That can change over time, and indeed it's quite important to reflect actually that it's a dynamic engagement with children and young people as their needs change, and also can vary hugely in severity. The data that we look at obviously brings back, shows what the primary need may be, so we can see educational attainment presented by different levels of, by different types of primary need, and how that then interacts with specific educational outcomes. And I think we look quite closely at understanding, for example, the interaction between low prior attainment and how that then plays into educational outcomes, where actually in some of the areas where we're seeing greatest growth in primary need, some of the areas like autism spectrum and social and emotional health, there isn't necessarily a correlation with low prior attainment. So actually we need to look quite carefully at the data and understand both different need and then how it translates into educational outcomes.
This committee, as you can imagine, is very keen on measuring things. And we're very keen on baselines, and we're very keen on collecting data digitally so that you are actually able to precisely track, and I only mentioned just 2 or 3 categories there, but are you in possession of sufficient data to be able to track precisely all the different components of people who've got special education needs?
We're developing our data strategy overall in relation to understanding the full picture across the country in terms of children and young people with special educational needs. We get survey data both through the school census and through particular census data in relation to children with special educational needs. We've been investing in a longitudinal study which is looking in more detail at the sorts of different experiences children and young people have in the system. And we also want to build our understanding in more detail, working with experts through our, for example, neurodiversity task force, looking particularly closely at some of the areas where we're seeing the greatest growth in need. And we can say some more about that if that would be useful.
I think we may come back to that
underlying
in a little later in the hearing, because it's really important that we know actually precisely how your interventions are affecting each of those sort of needs, as it were. Can I perhaps come to you, Jonathan Marron, for my last question in the session and ask you the same question? Do you have sufficient data to be able to measure health outcomes as a result of people who've got severe education needs and EHCPs?
Yes, so we are also working hard to improve our data. So clearly we're interested in the needs and the service of all children with needs, some of whom will have special education needs, some won't. So there are 1.1 million children in contact with mental health, learning disability, autism specialist services in the NHS. Some of those will be special education needs, some will not. So we have broad data on those. Our data on our range of services here, community health services, is improving, but not as good as our hospital data. We have some services where our data is particularly poor, ADHD assessments, very significant change in practice, real expansion. Again, data not very clear there at all. We are both working with a task force in the NHS to try and define roles and have worked with the National Institute for Health Research to actually commission primary data on how we should make that in the first place. And again, another project with the NHIR looking at how we might track the need for therapists to support SEND children, which we don't have any really clear metrics of. So really significant things to help. And then, of course, we're doing the sort of more rough and ready stuff with the NHS benchmarking service, really getting into what do we know collectively about these services and can we get more information out. So we're in a much better position than we were 5 or 6 years ago, but definitely more to do on really fixing the data in some of these community health services, which this committee has talked about previously.
Well, since this committee is so keen on data, could I ask both of you, perhaps after this hearing, to let us have a note on what data you are collecting, so that we know precisely what baselines you've got. But we've got an awful lot to get through today. And now my colleague, Nesl Taliskin, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And it's really on the back of your question around health data and the data around children and young people sustaining employment beyond Key Stage 4. From a slightly different perspective, I think it's well documented that those who are in long-term employment have better health outcomes. That's true of everybody, but it is particularly true of those who have special educational needs, and NHS England reports state that over and over again. So the disparity between the 69% of those with SEN at Key Stage 4 who sustained education, apprenticeship or employment versus the 85% that the Chair referenced earlier is of particular concern. And I note some of the responses we've had already. I just wanted to probe a bit more. What should that 69% figure be? Do departments have a view as to whether that should improve on an annual basis, if it should be 85%? What would good look like, and is there a trajectory and a timeline associated with what I can assume is an ambition to improve the 69%?
Thanks very much indeed. I'll start and I might hand over to others. So I think it would be fair to say we don't have a point target for what we think that number should be, although we think it should be higher than 69%. And I just want to explain why that isn't just because we haven't thought about it. And it starts from the point that Juliet was making about the fact that the definition of SEND is a relative one. So the definition of SEND is that you have a need that can't be met by ordinary education provision. So you almost inherently start from a point where it's quite difficult to work out. And again, this links a bit to the questions you were asking about the kind of the fundamentals in our data. So typically the challenges in our data are not because we don't track the outcomes of those people who have been identified as having a need either at SEND support level or at EHCP level. But it's quite difficult to be certain that the type of need that is being identified this year is the same as the type of need that was being identified last year or the year before. Such evidence as we do have suggests that there's a combination of better diagnosis and understanding of need, social and medical factors driving those changes, and in some cases shifting diagnostic criteria, which Jonathan might want to speak about. And we see that particularly in autistic spectrum disorder and in ADHD in particular. We have seen shifts in diagnostic criteria. And that means it's really difficult to work out. So even in the figures I gave earlier where I said there has been some improvement in the educational outcomes, it's still quite difficult to work out if that is the system absolutely doing better for a very, very similar group of young people, or if it's identifying and catching a slightly different group of young people within those definitions. And that's a real challenge, because you don't want to move to a kind of a deep kind of medical diagnosis-based model. It's right to have a model that's based on identifying challenges and gaps with people compared to normal provision. But it also means that, for example, if you massively improve the inclusiveness of your normal provision, you'd expect to see the number of people identified drop. But then you might see their relative outcomes get worse because you're identifying a much smaller proportion of the cohort. So it's properly challenging to work out what you think the answer to that should be, other than that you want wherever you possibly can to see convergence, and you want to test wherever you can like-for-like outcomes for similar people, and to identify gaps and differences in different areas and between different institutions. So the other thing we look at really hard is where we see differences in outcomes for children and young people who have broadly similar levels of need but have had different experiences in the system. And that there you can say, well, you want everyone to get as close as possible to having the outcomes that the best have. I'm sorry, it's a long answer.
No, that's fine.
There's a real challenge.
It's a really important question.
There's a real challenge underpinning this about the relativeness of the definitions.
Is it worth me coming on the health?
Yes, but briefly, please. We've got an awful lot to get through.
So I do think our understanding of these conditions is changing. Our clinical understanding is changing, and indeed the social our broader as a society, the acceptability of talking about it, having your child, has all changed. So I think we're seeing a great increase in the numbers of people coming forward. The latest estimates out of NHS Digital for the number of children and young people who might have a diagnosable mental health condition not that have come forward, so a prevalence rate is as high as 1 in 5. So a very significant challenge, I think, on how do we support people, how do we make sure that our children are supported in school and by the health services as a mainstream. I mean, 1 in 5 is not specialist, is it? So I think broad sense there. I would say two things. Autism, clearly our practice has changed very significantly in the last 10 and 15 years. NHS England produced a national framework and a set of operational guidance on autism only in 2023 to try and pull together that practice, both the commissioning, strategic practice, what should you be doing as a service, but also how should you run an autism service, how should you do diagnosis. So I think great strides there. On ADHD, we looked actually in January this year, a review of those services again by NHS England, with quite a lot of concern of actually, are we clear about who are we diagnosing for, what's the balance of treatment between therapeutic options, between medicines. So actually we've launched a task force to look at that, come back in spring of next year. But I think there's a great deal to do to really understand what is the right way of supporting these children. And then, of course, that will feed into the schools and the SEN debate too.
Thank you both for that. I mean, this is a very important part of it. We may come back to this, but we've got an awful lot to get through, as I say. So my colleague now, Sarah Green, please.
Thank you, Chair. The NAO report spells out quite clearly how too many families are waiting too long, not just for the support they need, but in some cases for the assessment in the first place. So can I ask Jonathan and Susan in the first instance what you're doing to reduce the time that families are waiting to receive the support they desperately need?
Yes, and you're right. We've seen a drop in the number of assessments for education, health and care plans that have been done within the 20-week time period that we seek to do them within. It's improved very slightly between 2022 and 23, but that's following a drop before that. I think I would say a couple of things about waiting time. So the first thing is it does go back to the kind of underpinning analysis that was set out in the Green Paper in 2022, which is that the system, the changes to the system that were made in 2014 set up some incredibly clear and comprehensive entitlements for the support that you could attract if you had a statutory plan, but much less clear entitlements to the support you would get if you didn't have a plan. And that, I think undoubtedly, completely rationally, has driven more people to try to seek support through a plan because it's clearer what they're going to get. And that set up a vicious cycle in which more and more of the available resource in the system was going to people who had plan-based support, and there was less available to do early intervention and to give more comprehensive cohort-based support to groups of people who hadn't got an individualised plan. So part of the challenge here is we want more people to be having their plans done in good time, but we also want more people to be able to get the support they need without having to go through that process at all. So if you look at the numbers on plans being delivered within the 20-week timescale, the kind of shocking headline statistic is that only 50% of those plans are being done within 20 weeks. But if you look at the absolute numbers, in 2015, when it was closer to 60% of plans that were being done on time, the total number of plans that were being written was about 11,675. The total number of plans in 2023 was 38,471 that were done on time. So there were more than 3 times as many plans done on time in 2023 as in 2015, but as a proportion it was significantly lower because the total number of plans had accelerated so incredibly fast. The overall level of special educational needs measured by SEND support as well as EHCP went up by about 14%. The proportion of EHCP plans went up by about 40%, 40. So we must try and make sure people are getting assessed when they need to be assessed, but we also think that it's really important that it's possible for people to get more support without having to go through an assessment process. And when you look at the types of need that we've seen accelerating, it's autistic spectrum disorder, social, emotional and mental health need, and speech, language and communication needs that have driven about 88% of that increase in education, health and care plans. So we also want to be putting in place really good quality support that means that everybody can get both straightforwardly identified, but also more important than the identification is the support, what gets put in place for people. For example, programmes like the Nuffield Early Language Intervention has screened over 640,000 primary-age children in the first years of primary school to identify challenges with language, which goes directly to that increase in speech, language and communication needs. And if we can do that, then we avoid the need for people to go through a plan writing process and to be sat in that queue. The other thing we're doing is looking local authority by local authority at the waiting times and the level of delay, and they vary absolutely enormously. So in Helen Hayes' constituency there are crosses 2 boroughs. In Lambeth 71.5% of education, health and care plans are written on time. In Southwark it's 19.2%. The circumstances in Lambeth and Southwark are a bit different, but probably not that different, I suggest. And so we're also doing really targeted work through our regional teams to work with those areas which have the biggest challenges in timeliness to try and improve what they're able to do. And now I'll stop talking so Jonathan will talk about health.
Thank you.
We're going to have some quite brisker answers, I think, otherwise you'll still be here at midnight.
Well, let's try not to do that. So, on health, look, I think one thing that's really clear, that the big rises in the requirement assessments of autism, speech and language, and mental health, some of the most challenged services in the health service. We have long waits for access to these services generally, and of course we're dealing with both special educational needs and children who come through from the normal health pathway. We are trying to fix all of those in really quite significant investment. Over the period of the report, mental health spending has gone from 11 billion to over 17 billion. We've seen a 40% increase in the number of mental health staff. If you take speech and language therapy, just since 2019, that's up 20%. So whilst we are putting lots of service and resource into these services, we're facing a level of demand that we are running just to try and keep up with. I do think in ADHD assessments we face a significant challenge, which why I mentioned before. We're trying to look at actually what's our service model and are we getting that right. And with autism, again, a very, very significant increase, both in children and indeed in adults actually coming forward for autism assessments. We are trying to work through what is the right service to do that.
Can I ask specifically about educational psychologists? Because forgive me, I'm not quite sure where it would sit, whether it sits in the Department for Education or the Department for Health and Social Care. If you could clarify that for me, I'd appreciate it. But what specifically is being done to retain those educational psychologists within local authority employment and to recruit more? Because that is one of the biggest backlogs, if that makes sense, right now.
Thank you. So educational psychologists who carry out assessments for SEND are employed by local government. So in a twist, if you really wanted me to, I could tell you it was MHCLG, but actually it's us. We work very closely with local government both to try and support retention of educational psychologists and to train additional educational psychologists. So we put additional funding into the system to train. First chunk was 200 and then another 400 educational psychologists who we've invested in additional funding to train and add to the system. I would just say again, though, that the balance between... So it goes to that point about the huge rise in the absolute numbers of plans that need writing. And what we see in some of the areas where we've worked through, either through our change programme or through delivering better value or safety valve, all of which look at how we can try and pull more resource upstream into more effective preventative work, where we can get more education psychologist time spent on supporting children and young people and less actually overall on assessing them, we see better outcomes for children and young people. And we also know that that's more rewarding work for education psychologists to do. So there's something about putting the funding in to train and support them and thinking about trying to make sure they're deployed in ways that are focused on giving effective help and support to children and young people.
I have a final question, if I may, Chair, and it's to both Alison, if I may, and to Jonathan, and it's around where you find good practice. because it's certainly out there. We tend to focus on the negative, but where you find good practice, how is that then rolled out and shared, not just with local authorities but with schools as well? How does that work across both departments?
I'll start off particularly with schools and education settings. So I think that's an excellent point, and as Susan said in her opening remarks, the fact that a majority of parents, if not enough parents, are happy with the support their children get for their special educational needs shows that there are many settings that do a fantastic job on this already, and who do sometimes, despite quite significant headwinds, provide a really excellent service and really good support. So we're absolutely keen to be identifying those areas and spreading that good practice wherever we can. And the variation that we see on all these different measures shows that if we could support some of those settings and providers to come up towards the level of their most successful colleagues, we can make a big difference to children and young people. So in terms of sharing good practice, I mean, Susan's referred to our regional teams who work very closely with not just local authorities, but multi-academy trusts and directly with schools in different areas to help them improve their practice, share good practice, work in the collaborative way we know we need to deliver in a joined-up way for families. I'd also mention our change programme, which was one of our commitments in last year's improvement plan. And that involves 32 local authorities in all 9 of the English regions, where we've got groups of local authorities working together to both to test some of the interventions that we described in the improvement plan, but also where they are successful in building up good practice, to be sharing and disseminating that.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I now move, I hope you got the message. Rachel Gilmore, please.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, Chair, I think Jonathan was just going to...
Oh, yes, he was going to say something.
Well, very briefly, we're only on question 2 and we've got 18 to go, and we've been at it for half an hour.
So I think
extremely brief answers.
3 very brief points then. I think there are some areas where practice is changing so quickly. We're trying to make sure that there's national guides to help people, autism, ADHD particularly. I think there are other areas where actually with education we've got particular projects on the ground, the PINS project and the LSEC project, which we'll probably come to later, really great examples of how do we get specialist support into mainstream early. I think that's a great way to spread a good practice. And then finally, I just pointed the CQC Ofsted reports, which they're now done 43, I think, a quarter of which has come out as in the best possible category. So that's a great place to look for where the best performance in the country is today.
Thank you for that. Rachel, you have to leave early.
Yes, could I ask Susan Acland-Hood and Jonathan Marron, how are you improving your collective understanding of the reason for the increase in SEND support and the EHCP's demand and what this means for the future? So do you have a sort of prognosis that you can use the data that you've got now? I accept that it's a very complex area and there are complex issues, but do you have the ability to do that going forward?
Shall I start just on need? So I think on the level of need in the population of children, I think we've got reasonable data. We're trying to work through the actual growth in need, what is actually just more people coming forward and what's changing clinical practice. I think all those things are happening simultaneously. So we're working through that. In some areas, there's definitely a need for more information data, and I think one of the areas that we found most difficult is then linking through this rise in need in the population to actually what does that mean for children with special education needs. And there we've got specific research. We're out for commission at the moment with the NHIR to try and do a particular piece of research there to give some in-depth knowledge. And I think this will be our challenge, that there's a sort of growth in children needing help from health services, but then how that exactly plays through into what schools settings should be and how much you can do in mainstream, I think, is the challenge for us that Susan might step to.
Yes, I mean, as I say, I think we've got a good grasp of the kind of key needs that are rising. So autistic spectrum disorder, speech, language and communication needs, and social, emotional and mental health make up 88% of the rise in the HCPs, as I said. And then within that, we can use international studies to look at what we're seeing relatively consistently globally. So there's a meta-study which is called Talent Saver et al. From 2023, which shows across 29 countries the global point prevalence of ASD consistently increasing from about 0.25% during the period from 94 to 99 towards 0.99% in the 2015 to 2017 period. So some of this you can see globally. and then some of it looks more different here than elsewhere, which suggests there may be more systemic factors. So again, those may be the areas where what you're seeing is more challenge in meeting need in the mainstream education system, driving a perception that there are needs that can't be met ordinarily. And so trying to put those two things together, again, is a really important part, and was an important part of the change programme that we're already running and of our future work. We'll continue to work on it. We've also got a joint task force specifically focused on neurodiversity, which was set up between the two departments to keep working on that.
I've got one quick question, but if I could just give you some feedback from my constituency where there's a particularly high level of SEN and particularly poor provision and particularly poor... My constituents and their parents are crying out for this cross-sector, you know, social services, schools and the NHS. You're not going to achieve it if you don't do it. But that aside, what are you doing to build a robust understanding of the type and location of provision available and needed to support children now and in the future, which kind of goes back to that kind of off-piece comment I made?
Yes, so we've got, I think, if you'll forgive me, I won't repeat the stuff on looking at need. In terms of what provision is available, we've done, over the last 2 years, we've done a more specific collection on special educational needs capacity across the system, and we've actually started using that to drive some of our funding allocations as well, in order to try and identify the places where we have the biggest gaps between capacity and need. Again, we're doing that in the context of a system in which we see really strongly differing practice in what proportion of need, even of need within the HCP, can be met in mainstream. So you see figures that range from, so I mean, even within the membership of this committee, in Richmond Park, 73% of pupils with the HCPs are in mainstream settings, whereas in Burnley it's 45%. So you're seeing really, really different approaches to how those needs can be met. And so we're trying both to catch the capacity and to keep working together to try and spread really effective practice on how to support needs really well. And again, this isn't about, there will always be some people whose needs will be much better met in a specialist setting, and this isn't about trying to put people in inappropriate settings, but it is about recognising that because the definition is relative, anybody whose need isn't being well met in mainstream is likely to then be identified, and you can address that either by over time massively increasing the amount of specialist provision or by trying to make the mainstream provision work better for more people.
Thank you. Chris Kane.
Thank you, Chair. Can I pick up on a comment you made earlier about data, and you're working hard to improve data? What does that look like? What is the work that's being done? And what sort of time scale is it before you would expect to see improvements in data collection? Can I ask Susan and maybe Jonathan that as well, please?
Yes. So, as I say, there's to my mind, the most fundamental difficulty with data in this space is that you have a fundamental definition at the heart of this, which is relatively subjectively driven and is driven differently in different places. And to try to get underneath that, we're looking harder at experiences by primary type of need, and we're also looking at how that intersects with low prior attainment data in order to try and understand the differences. When you go beyond that, the other piece of work we've been doing through the change programme is looking at much better data flows from local authorities so that we can understand different experiences and practices across the country. And I might hand to Alison on that, because we have been developing and testing much better data dashboards with local authorities as part of that work, so that people can see and understand the differences in practice and outcomes between them in order to help drive the sharing of best practice that we've been talking about. Alison, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, I mean, I would say before I say more about the change programme that some of this in terms of really understanding the picture we're seeing, particularly given I think the NAO report talks about a broad and relative concept of SEND, so really getting under the skin of what we're actually delivering for children and young people. has to go back to what Juliet described in terms of a range of measures, so looking at academic achievement at different key stages, for example, and particularly at low priority attainers, but also other measures that tell us about the experience of children and young people in the system, whether that's school attendance, which is, we think, quite a good proxy for how at home and supported children feel in their school or their setting. And also, for example, Ofsted's parent survey, which tells us something about family experience. In terms of the change programme, this again goes back to some of the commitments we set out in last year's improvement plan. We've undertaken significant work in those 32 local authorities I described in the 9 areas to develop sort of better measures for transparency in terms of dashboards that give us some of those key indicators. So, for example, not just the proportion of children accessing education, health and care plans, but within that, the proportion of children with those plans who are supported in their local nursery or school or college, and other measures that show how well those different statutory services, so particularly health and education, are working together. So none of that, I think, in itself completely helps us overcome the issue Susan's described with data, which is that you are working with a shifting population that's defined in quite different ways at times. But that's all really important work we've done ever since our Green Paper publication in 2022 to work out the best ways to get transparency on the system and make sure that we're collecting data and measuring the most important things.
I think on health, so really we're talking about information in community health services and mental health provision, which certainly members of this committee will be well aware that traditionally has not been as strong as our hospital data sets. So I think over the last few years we've made significant improvements and we'll continue to do that. On the community health services data, particularly the waiting time data, we're working with NHS benchmarking, a group of statisticians within the NHS that do data improvement. So practical, in the moment, can we make this better? But we're also looking at things that we genuinely don't know the answers to. So the research work we have underway is looking at, like I say, the connection between need for therapy and special education needs, and really with the changes in ADHD and the therapeutical model, really basically asking the question, what should we be collecting and have we got the right data set? So I think we have both the, in the moment, can we make what we've got better, and are we thinking about have we got the right information in the longer run? So quite a broad agenda on data in this space for us.
If you excuse just one quick follow-up on that. Just something, Alison, you were saying, am I hearing that the problem isn't so much with the way that you're collecting the data, the interface to get the data, it's to do with a broader societal problem of what, movement of people, or what is there a problem you can solve in data collection with the dashboards, or is there something much broader that makes it harder to actually get the data that you need when you need it?
So I absolutely think we can do better with our data, and in terms of really understanding the journey that children and young people are following. But I don't think even radically improved data collection in itself will solve the issue. And some of that, as Susan's described, is because at the moment we're working with quite a relative definition of SEND, which makes it difficult both to compare like for like, but also to be confident in observing a trajectory year on year, if you like.
Okay, thank you. Susan, can I ask you about paragraph 2.4 on the report, which talks about the proportion of children identified as having special educational needs and how it differs across local authorities, and there does seem to be some wide variation in some of the figures. So why does the level of support children with special educational needs receive depend on where they'll ever go to school?
I do think some of this comes back to the fundamental definition of SEND. So SEND is inherently defined relative to mainstream education. So the 2014 Children and Families Act definition of SEND is where someone has a learning difficulty or disability which calls for special educational provision to be made for him or her. So it is to some extent a little bit circular. And that means that we have seen, and the history is that we've seen different local authorities over time take very different approaches to seeking to meet particular types or levels of need in mainstream schools by working on their inclusiveness, or by moving those out of mainstream schools. And we also see very different levels in the extent to which, for example, you see schools having resource-based or SEND provision within. And now for some of those, whether they're in school or not, you will need to seek an education, health and care plan. But the system is not set up such that there is a single simple threshold either for SEND support or for an education, health and care plan which can be written down. It's based on assessments against that criterion of whether or not they have a learning difficulty or disability which calls for special educational provision to be made for them. And so it relates to a judgment about the difference between their need and what's being provided in the local education system. And so some of that variation will be because of choices that have been made in the local area about the mainstream education offer, and some of it will be about different levels of judgment. And then beyond that, which is why I say that at the bottom of quite a lot of the data questions is a real difficulty, that the fundamental underpinning definition of SEND isn't necessarily consistent across time or place.
And I think if I may just build on that for a moment, I know you want to keep answers short. It talks in the report, and I think other witnesses have mentioned, that overwhelmingly the growth in SEND need that we see is in three categories. So autistic spectrum conditions, speech, language and communication needs, and social, emotional and mental health, which is a very broad category, which includes ADHD, which Jonathan's referred to, also children with behavioural challenges, and to some degree mental health conditions that we see reported in young people. So all of those are broad categories that will include really significant ranges of need within them, and some of those may be more developmental needs that can be supported with quite short-term interventions. Others will obviously represent much more intrinsic lifelong need. So I think taking that into account also helps explain why we see such significant variation in the way different local authorities present their need.
So my next question was going to be, how do you ensure greater consistency across schools in identifying the children? But I suppose I'll put a caveat to that, which is greater consistency possible?
I think it is possible. I mean, I think it's very difficult to think about identification without thinking about the provision alongside, because of the nature of that definition. So I think what we would absolutely seek is greater consistency and improvement in the provision that is made to meet need, at which point that itself starts to improve your consistency of identification, because the identification is so closely linked to a judgment against what's available, if that makes sense. So that's why, again, the work that Alison has described on the change programme to try and identify good practice and spread it, but also there's a set of programmes that we're running that are focused on some of those needs that we see growing most rapidly. So we have two programmes that are focused on speech, language and communication in slightly different ways. So the Nuffield Early Language Intervention I mentioned earlier is focused on improving speech and language skills of children aged between 4 and 5, and it includes a screening element. So about 640,000 primary school children have already been screened, and about over 200,000 children have had their language skills improved, and we see about 4 months progress in oral skills for children who have that intervention, and about 7 months for children who are eligible for free school meals. And so putting more children through programmes like that addresses some of the identification challenges, but to some extent, because it also makes provision, and often speech and language needs are not lifelong. They are needs where, if they're addressed well and early, you remove the need for more expensive intervention later. But you effectively remove the question about kind of, are people identifying correctly on the HCP, because you're just putting children through a programme that means that if there's a challenge, it's not just identified, but it's immediately met through the same programme. And then similarly, Early Language and Speech for Every Child, LSEC, is funding innovative workforce models to look at early identification for children and people with speech, language and communication needs, and that's in early years in primary school, so that's covering an earlier period than Nelly work as well. The interim report on that is not due until December, but we are already seeing some really good examples through the change programme. So Barnet, for example, have supported over 1,000 children through their LSEC Universal and Targeted offer. And then Partnerships for Inclusion of Neurodiversity in Schools, the PINS programme, which is a joint programme between us and the Department for Health, deploys specialists from health and educational workforces to strengthen training and resources for school staff, and will upskill about 10% of mainstream primary schools by this coming March, by March 2025. And I would expect that we would want to continue that beyond then as well, because, again, that's about trying to build capability in schools to meet need that take you a bit away from this definition that is kind of against a deficit in the provision that is being seen. If that makes sense.
It does.
Sorry, I'm really sorry these answers are long, but it's complicated.
Thank you for that. Can I build on that? Paragraph 2.28 of the report. It's looking about the need to get in and do more identification before school. Mm-hmm. You know, so can you talk a little bit more? I don't know if it's Susan or Alison, but what are you doing to make sure that providers are being able to identify and support children before they start school?
I might actually ask Jonathan to come in on this, because this starts with health checks in early life, and indeed some of it starts at birth.
So our health visitor programme, one of its key elements are checks on children for their level of development at 12 months, and then again between 2 and 2.5 years. So this really allows an early identification of children that might have speech and language needs, other developments, and allows then a referral to other services. Whilst I know health visitors have reduced quite substantially in numbers, I think that's in the report, actually we're still seeing around just over 80% of children have that 12-month check, and just under 80% is having the 2.5-year check. And those numbers have been steady over the last 6 or so years. So we are managing that programme of making sure children are assessed early on and then follow-up levels of support if needed. With the Department for Education, of course, we've also been rolling out a set of family hubs in 75 local authorities, backed by £300 million worth of investment over 3 years, which again is providing more of that opportunity for children to come with their parents to a centre, have access to a whole range of support. We're particularly interested in early parenting support, relationships, mental health, breastfeeding, but that opportunity to see other services is there.
We are really going to have to speed up everything. Colleagues, I'm afraid there's going to be very little supplementary. It's only going to be the planned questions, and really short questions, short answers is what we're after, please. Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. Susan Acland-Hood, how are you building a shared understanding of where special educational needs fits across government, individual organisations' priorities? And this is kind of in relation to the system challenge that so many schools and parents are experiencing, that the sort of the gaps in provision between different organisations.
So I'm going to ask Juliet to talk a bit about the governance and leadership of this in the department, which stretches across the whole of government. But I would also say partnerships with local authorities are absolutely key to this, and we do everything we do on SEND in deep partnership with local authority partners, and listening to them on the kind of pieces they find it hard to put together on the ground to try and make provision at central government level to address that. Juliet?
Yeah. So just after the election, we moved the Special Educational Needs Directorate into the schools group, part of the Department for Education, recognising how critical it was to make sure that we were thinking about mainstream education in all aspects in relation to inclusive practice and SEND system. But a critical part of that is how we're working right across government to support the whole system. So we've created a new cross-government portfolio board, which essentially has membership of all the key departments you would expect to be around the table, working very closely with health colleagues, MHCLG, with the Treasury and others. And then, as Susan says, working very closely with local government partners. But also, as the Secretary of State set out in her speech last week, that we will also bring together a number of experts to help us essentially build that sort of deep expertise and partnership necessary for this next phase of work. So working with Tom Rees, who is the Chief Executive of Ormiston Academy, who will help us be working on inclusive practice and working closely with a range of different school leaders and right across the system, and Dame Christine Lenehan, with her role really drawing on deep expertise of working right across local systems, working closely with parents and families, and drawing on that lived experience as well. So really deliberately trying to create both formal governance in terms of the way we think across government, and that sits as part of the overall opportunity mission and our approach to making sure this, thinking 0 to 25 all the way through, but also deep into the system as well.
And Ms. Chua, do you think this is going to be this approach is going to be effective in terms of chasing out some of the disincentives that currently exist within the system, particularly in schools, where they're not having to accept SEN pupils, and the financial disincentive remains? Do you think this approach will be effective at addressing some of those issues?
I think the government's made really clear that a deep commitment to inclusive mainstream is absolutely at the heart of our approach, and learning from a lot of the programmes that have already been described today in terms of the work on the change programme, we need to absolutely make sure that we are looking deeply at the different incentives, the levers that exist in terms of the way in which schools support children and young people with special educational needs. We've already identified a number of different kind of key processes which will take account of how we promote really best practice in terms and change some of those incentives in the system. So thinking about the curriculum and assessment review led by by Professor Becky Francis, we'll be looking explicitly at making sure that the curriculum assessment review is thinking about the barriers within inclusive mainstream and making sure that's reflected. And in parallel, Ofsted are looking at the way in which they will think about inclusion as part of the work they're doing to look at the inspection framework and the relationship between that and a new single report card.
Just very quickly, do you think this will be kind of, dare I say, tinkering with the existing system, or do you think in due course this will be a kind of a whole system, a whole new system?
We think there is a real opportunity to join these incentives up to create a very strong recognition for the work that mainstream schools do with children with special educational needs, and to both, and we talked about outcomes earlier, both recognise progress and outcomes for children with special educational needs, but also support schools and build capacity and build the confidence of teachers and leaders to be able to make sure they've got the tools, the interventions, which builds off what we've been learning in recent years into that approach.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Very good. Anna Dixon, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And before I get into my questions, I'd just like to declare an interest for the public record that I previously worked at the Department of Health and Social Care with both Jonathan Marron and with Juliet Chua. I also have a niece with autism who was supported through an internship with the civil service recently. I'd like to get onto the subject of special school capacity. Draw your attention to paragraph 2.23 in the NAO report, which suggests that school places, the demand for special school places is exceeding capacity by around 4,000 pupils. But at the same time, there are also some special schools that are working at overcapacity. So it suggests that there's a real imbalance there. I wondered if you could clarify, perhaps Susan or Alison, about what you're doing to ensure that special school capacity is right, whether that's within local areas for particular special needs or indeed across the country.
Sure, thanks. I'm very happy to come in on that. So I think going back to some of what we've covered so far, we're really keen to make sure that we've got the right balance between excellent special school provision for the children who need it, but also really excellent mainstream provision for those who can thrive in mainstream. And in the best examples of local areas, we see those two sectors working very, very closely in partnership. But there is evidence that a high number of special schools are either at capacity or over capacity with high demand for places. The most recent figure we've got is around 63%, so that is obviously a very high proportion of them. On your question about outcomes, and we do unsurprisingly have some evidence that students in overcrowding settings, whether that's special or mainstream, may have lower attainment. That's obviously not just in terms of academic attainment, but the committee's interest so far in transitions preparation for adulthood. It's obviously harder for overcrowded settings to provide that to the high quality that we expect and which the Code of Practice requires. So that is why we have seen very significant investment in high needs capital, in particular since 2018-19, with investment of over £3 billion. The very high proportion of that, so 2.4 billion, has been spent since 22-23, and the assurance data that we now collect, which we've now in our second cycle of that Susan described, suggests that that's created around 50,000 new places in special schools. The other point I'd make on that, I think, is that it's yet another area where we see very significant local variation. So there are some local areas which have a high proportion of their young people with education, health and care plans in special schools. There are others that support a majority of them in mainstream. So it may be that there's more we can do to understand exactly what good looks like, particularly in supporting young people with those needs where we've seen the biggest growth. So autism, social, emotional, mental health are great examples of that, in order to get that balance right and make sure that local authorities can get their provision on a sustainable footing.
So can I follow up? Because obviously, as you yourselves have already said, there's a dynamic here that if you have the right support in mainstream schools, there's likely to be less demand for specialist school places. And indeed, I've evidence from constituents that parents are in a sense being forced to consider specialist schools, even if they would prefer their child to be supported in mainstream schools. Even with an EHCP, they're not being able to get the right support in the mainstream. You yourselves as well have talked about sort of ordinary education, so effectively this being a relative thing, that if ordinary education were getting worse, this might be another explanation for why we're seeing the uptick in both demand for EHCPs. So I was talking to Bradford, which does reasonably well in the face of quite a lot of challenges in terms of, maintaining children in more inclusive mainstream settings. But they have invested in specialist teams and send school improvement advisors. So I suppose I wanted to really get down to what else do you think you need to do and or understand to make sure that the capacity that we do have in specialist schools is there for those children who really need it?
Thank you. I mean, I think this comes back to that focus on really improving inclusive mainstream, which ministers have set out as their core focus. And I think that's not just about what is sometimes described as ordinarily available provision, in other words, what every school should be able to do for a child with some needs that differ from their fellow pupils. It's also about recognising and supporting things like resource-based provisions that are based in school and allow children to spend some of their time in mainstream classes and some being supported outside, which again we think is a positive model, but again we see that very variably across the country. And I think the kind of key ingredients here are about using what we know already and spreading effective practice. So it goes back to the comment that was made earlier about there being some really good practice on this, and we've used both the change programme that Alison referred to earlier and our work through Safety Valve and Delivering Better Value, both of which in different ways work with local authorities to look at how they can shift provision from kind of later intervention to earlier and more widespread and inclusive intervention. We have some really good examples of the things that authorities have done using that Safety Valve and Delivering Better Value support, which have allowed them to support more children more effectively in mainstream schools in a way that is supported by parents. So I think the point that you make about we should really be thinking about parental wishes here all the way through. And I'm very conscious that when we talk about inclusive mainstream, there's a risk that parents may hear that as seeking to support children in mainstream who really need specialist provision. And it is much more, as you say, about making sure the specialist provision is available for those children for whom that is undoubtedly the right place to be. And again, I'm conscious of time. I mean, I can give examples from
I think
some of the local authorities.
I think we need to keep going.
Just final point then on specialist school provision. I think we're going to come back to questions about sort of cost effectiveness and value for money on this. But one of the consequences, I think, of not having enough places, and perhaps, you know, as we've said, part of that's inclusive mainstream, but then not enough places in specialist schools, is pushing children into alternative provision and pupil referral units. I wondered if you had the data on the proportion of children with SEN who were in alternative provision and PRUs, and whether you view that as a failure of the system.
So if you look at children with EHCPs, the proportion of children and young people with an EHCP, and this data goes back to 2015, so it was statements in 2015 and then became EHCPs, has actually stayed relatively level at about 1% of the total cohort. But of course, the total cohort size has gone up, and it's a higher proportion of those with SEN support. But we've seen less shift in that than we've seen from mainstream to specialist and indeed to independent. So in 2015, about 58% of those on statements were in mainstream schools. It's now about 42% of those within the HCP.
Okay, I'll come back to the questions and then let the Chair proceed.
Sorry.
I've concluded my questions.
Thank you
Chair.
very much. Sorry, Anna. Helen Hayes, please.
Thank you.
Chair of the Education Select Committee.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I first of all apologise for my absence at the beginning of the meeting, which was due to attending the Chamber for the Statement on Children's Social Care, and also put on record my interest as the Vice President of the Local Government Association and as a member of the GMB Trade Union. I wanted to drill in a little bit more on the question of SEND support in mainstream schools and around the kind of government's definition of inclusivity and the plans to move towards a more inclusive mainstream. So please don't feel that you need to repeat things that you've said already, but I just would like to dig in a little bit more detail if that's okay. So we know that parents have very, very little confidence in the ability of schools to deliver SEND support, that schools are struggling to do so, and that the government is behind on the recruitment of and training of SENCOs. So I wanted to ask about firstly, what the government's overall plan is to increase you've spoken a bit about some of the things that you believe are effective, but we nevertheless are in a situation of kind of great challenge with regard to the delivery of SEND support in schools. So what are you doing to ensure that higher quality SEND support is more consistently available in mainstream schools?
Thank you. So just to start with where parents are, because I think it is probably worth saying that obviously 67% of children with SEND in state schools feel their children got the support they needed. That's 2/3. Obviously, that's still a third who feel that they're not getting their support. And so, recognising that and that we're all absolutely here because we want to improve the support children and young people receive. And as the government's made very clear, improving the offer through inclusive mainstream is absolutely the heart of our approach. We've been obviously talking to ministers in some detail on this, and we will be obviously bringing forward further work in this space. But what I can describe today is some of the things that we've already set out very clearly. So we've described, as I said earlier, on the curriculum and assessment review, an expectation that will look closely at how you remove the barriers for children and young people with special educational needs in the curriculum and assessment space, which is such a critical part when too often I think children and young people feel they can't access the curriculum, that it doesn't work for particular groups within who have special educational needs. Looking at the role that Ofsted play in terms of actually some of those incentives in the system, in terms of actually really promoting and getting very, very good practice on inclusivity. But at the heart of this is a question about what are the characteristics of a really good inclusive school. And there are obviously a number of different evidence sources for this already. You can look at the work the EF have done, look at work that's been brought forward by other bodies, which point to the importance of the ethos of the school, the way that the school is actually operating and supporting, a supportive environment for all pupils. Look at the way they understand the needs of all pupils, the way in which they're thinking about the access to high quality teaching. And we know that high quality teaching is absolutely critical for all pupils, and what is good, it's often quoted, what's good for pupils with SEND is also good for all pupils. So absolutely doubling down on high quality teaching. Also thinking about some of the particular tools, drawing on work that the EF have done and others about actually the sorts of types of intervention that work, small groups, flexible working, different types of intervention in that space, as well as also the effective work with teaching assistants who play a really critical role in the current system supporting children and young people with special educational needs, but really looking at how to deploy and work with teaching assistants effectively. So those are some of the features of strong, effective practice, but we will need to be developing that further. Tom Rees, as I mentioned earlier, is going to play a critical role working with us and with the system in terms of what does really excellent, inclusive mainstream practice look like.
Thank you. We know that there are children with additional needs in every single classroom in every single school across the country, but currently only just over half of all teachers say that they feel confident to meet the needs of students with additional needs. What are you doing to boost the confidence, skill and capacity amongst teachers to be able to meet the needs of every child in their classroom?
This is an area where we've been putting in place a number of interventions to really deepen the way in which the workforce does have the skills, experience and confidence to work with a broader range of need. We looked at the work done through the initial teacher training and the early curriculum framework, and looked and revised some of the content in terms of, so when teachers at very earliest stages in their career that they've got that input and experience. We've introduced a new national professional qualification for SENCOs, special educational need coordinators, with the first cohort starting this autumn. That provides a really serious 18-month worth of leadership qualification. Senkos are an absolutely critical part of every school in terms of the role they play to support work with the rest of leadership, think about teaching quality and think about the range of provision. So a new qualification, and all Senkos have to take this mandatory training within 5 years. But what's been interesting is we've been seeing schools putting forward not just their Senkos, but actually where they've got teachers who are sort of in training for leadership, seeing that as an absolutely critical qualification and development path on the way towards leadership. So growing that cadre of leaders who will essentially increase the confidence of the school overall to be able to address some of that sort of base, sort of core professional practice.
And to what extent are you expecting those changes to shift the balance from children who are currently seeking EHCPs back towards children who are supported in their mainstream school under SEND support? Have you got a kind of, how are you keeping track of the progress of these interventions, and how will you know whether they've been successful?
So, I mean, at the heart of the emphasis on inclusive mainstream is recognising that actually it's absolutely critical that you meet children's needs where they are, and that you remove the barriers to learning and education early. And indeed, a lot of the conversation today has been about actually earlier identification, early practice, and equipping all the key roles around a child and young person to be able to do that. So we will be obviously working through, we talked about outcomes earlier, the way in which we will need to track through impact and interventions through the course of this Parliament. But at the heart of that, that's that very strong emphasis in terms of recognising that what you need is a system in which a child's needs are met as they present.
Thank you. And then just a final question from me, Chair, if I may. Which is just to ask about the capital budget. So the government's announced capital funding for school buildings. What are you doing to ensure that the specification for new school buildings, where they are delivered across the country, is an inclusive specification that builds the physical fabric better to meet the needs of children with additional needs in an inclusive way in mainstream schools?
Thank you. So we have a set of core building designs which we use where we're building new schools, and they are well adapted to kind of accessibility, things like level access and toilets. I think that we need to keep revising those to make sure we're also thinking about, for example, the building in of small group workspace. So again, this goes to the point about the profile of need that we're seeing changing a bit over time, and we would always kind of keep those under review. It's also true that although we have some sort of standardised school building designs that we start from, we'll always then work in partnership and in conjunction with the school to understand the way that they work and to try and make sure that the building will work for them.
Thank you very much, Chair of the Education Select Committee. Luke Charteris.
Thank you. The proportion of EHCP appeals decided in favour of families is now at 98%, and that feels to me like a two-stage process that inherently actually favours better off parents with the financial means to go to tribunal and favours those with the know-how of the system. The broken appeals systems is making it harder for poorer families, isn't it?
So that headline number is kind of one that should give us all kind of pause on what is that telling us about our system more broadly. About 2.5% of appealable decisions go to appeal, so I think it's worth remembering that that is quite a small proportion of the total decision making, and we're also working very hard with the Ministry of Justice and the SEND Tribunal to do more work through ADR and other means, because we don't think that a very adversarial process is a positive feature of the system or one we should build on. And I do think there is a risk that it favours those who have got the capacity to navigate. I think the only other thing I would say is it is worth noting that the way that this is recorded in the tribunal means that it'll be recorded as a win, as it were, for the parents if it goes in their favour on any aspect of what is appealed, which does rather push that number up. So you could have a decision in favour of the local authority on several parts, but if it goes in favour of the family on any part, it's recorded in that kind of 99% plus figure. And we are working with the tribunal to try and disaggregate that a little bit more, because that doesn't necessarily help us understand exactly what is happening. Indeed.
I'll ask some follow-up on that and then bring in a new matter. Do you therefore think that that's driving inegalitarian outcomes in terms of which children are able to access an EHCP? And secondly, you touched on this point, but do you feel as though that's driving an adversarial system and how culturally can that be tackled with local authorities?
Yeah, so I think, I'd go back to the sort of fundamental analysis which was laid out in the Green Paper in 2022, which talked about that kind of vicious cycle where, because you get very clear entitlements if you have any HCP, but your entitlements are much less clear at the SEND support or at other levels, as more resource in the system goes towards supporting those who have statutory plans, it becomes more and more rational for as many people as possible to keep seeking those statutory plans because there's less resource left for the people who haven't got them. And breaking out of that vicious cycle has got to be an incredibly important part of what we seek to do, and that's why we're focusing so hard on the support that you can get in the system without having to go through plan writing or assessment processes. It's about recognising and meeting need and as Juliet says, meeting need where you are. And there are lots of reasons for that. One is because it gives a better service to everybody. A second is because it will make the system more efficient and allow us to use the resources better. But a third is because it will promote more egalitarian outcomes. So the more you ask people to go through significant substantial processes in order to get a good outcome, the more you are likely to favour those who have the capability to go through and capacity to go through and time to go through those processes.
But ultimately, with 1 in 40 now going to appeal, it's not very good VFM for the taxpayer either, is it?
Right.
Thank you.
That's the sort of answer we like. Michael Payne.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just declare an interest as a Vice President of the Local Government Association and also a current member of Nottinghamshire County Council and also a member of GMB and Unison. Just probing on this point, you described it, Susan, as being relatively small, but the figure is 15,600 families in terms of those that go to appeal, and these are 15,600 families of the most vulnerable children. 98% of them were decided in favour of families, which I think is shocking and worrying that only 2% are defended by local councils. And I just specifically want to press this point about what the DFE and the Department for Health and Social Care are doing with local authorities to both learn the lessons about why 98% are falling in favour of families and what both departments are doing with local authorities jointly to actually improve this situation. We heard a little bit earlier from Juliet about the cross-government board and how you were trying to draw in respective departments, but I just want to specifically probe this point about what you're doing in a joined-up fashion with local authorities to turn this situation around.
Yes, and I agree with you. I didn't mean to suggest at all that it was satisfactory. It's just worth setting it in the context of the total size of the system. I think, as I say, you do have to be slightly cautious on the 98% because that's 98% where any element of it is decided in favour of the family. But that still suggests a system in which we are not together, we're not operating in a very sensible way, given that you're going through an extremely laborious and time-intensive process for the family and for the local authority in order to reach that conclusion. I might bring Alison, we do everything we do on SEND in partnership with local authorities. It would be insane to do otherwise because they hold so much of the practice and the responsibility actually across this network. So when we have the change programme is a collaborative programme. It's really consciously designed to work with groups of local authorities and to have a presence in every region so that learning can be spread. We meet very regularly with the Association of Directors of Children's Services, and I also meet regularly with local authority chief executives because this is now on chief executives' radar in a way that I'm not sure it was in the past because of some of the challenges here. And everything we do and have done in this space we will co-design with local government, and I think it's incredibly important that we continue to do that.
Thank you, Michael Payne. Clive Betts, please.
Yes, a couple of issues. About a month ago I went to a very good event. It was the opening in Peak Centre in my constituency of a further education provision by Sheffield College for young people with special needs. Very good working relationship between the college and the council. I mentioned that because it's, I think, a rarity, isn't it? There's all too often children with special education needs who've been through system special schools or extensive help in mainstream schools are almost left by themselves to get on with it into further education, which can be a bit overwhelming for them. Didn't we ought to do more to make sure there's a better process for young people in this regard?
So I would certainly say that one of the things that comes through all our data is that we should be giving more attention to points of transition. So you see people fall out of the system at points of transition, both between primary and secondary and on transition into FE and to some extent into HE and adulthood as well. I would actually say I think that there is some incredibly good practice in supporting children and young people with SEND in further education colleges, and that to some extent it gives a pattern for some of the things that we would like to replicate in a more inclusive mainstream system in schools. And it's one of the things we talk about and share across the department, because actually children and young people are less likely to be in specialised provision 16 to 18 than they are before 16, and more likely to be in a mainstream FE college, often in provision that is quite carefully tailored and targeted to them, but which is part of the overall college provision. Now, there is some variation in that. Some colleges do it much better than others. We speak to the Association of Colleges, and they regularly remind us that they have some incredibly good practice in supporting children and young people with SEND at 16 to 18 that we could learn from earlier in the system.
This was a special provision that I mentioned, and one of the challenges was that there actually is a bottleneck in the special school system, which means children are being kept on at school beyond 16 in an appropriate provision because there wasn't anywhere for them to go. Shouldn't it's been an issue that was looked at more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think all the transition points are issues that we should look at, but there's, as I say, I'm sure we can do more on it, but you are more likely to end up in mainstream provision as a child with special educational needs post-16 than pre-16, and actually some of that provision is very good and supportive.
I come on to a pretty important issue now, that the local authorities, as we all know, have got some particularly serious financial challenges. One of them was sort of being helped on its way currently as in terms of the significant extra spending on special needs provision. Is for local authorities to have a statutory override, so they're spending their school grant, overspending it, but that overspending is not going to count in their general revenue budgets. They've been allowed to do this statutory override. I've never come across this before in local government. Isn't this just an indication of a service that is completely broken?
So the statutory override was introduced in 2020, and then it was extended in 2022, and it was introduced. So when it was introduced because it was clear that there were some challenges in implementing the 2014 reforms and the pressure that had brought about. I think it would be fair to say that when it was first introduced, it was believed that the deficits would be a short-term and relatively localised issue while those reforms were bedding in. I don't think that is something we believe anymore. And
said that almost with a straight face.
Well, I believe it to be true. Yeah. I mean, I think it was believed, but I think we need to recognise that isn't how it feels now. I think the challenge is, and you're right, it's very unusual, and I think it reflects some really unusual circumstances around that kind of growth in pressure. We've done a set of things which, again, the NAO report recognises that we have worked to seek to manage that with some of the local authorities most affected through the Safety Valve programme and delivering better value. And the NAO report also recognises that the situation would be worse if we hadn't done those things, but it continues to be really challenging, and we are working very closely with MHCLG and with the Treasury to look at the position for the future.
Right, well, that's my next question. You're starting to anticipate, because we looked in the Dealux Select Committee in the last Parliament at the issue of local authority finances, and this was a key one. And we tried to find out what was going to happen in 2026 when the override came to an end, because the deficits are still going to be there for local authorities, both historical and going forward. So have you got any idea what's going to happen? Is it going to be local authorities left to fund them? Some haven't got reserves to do it. Or is the Treasury going to come in and actually write them off?
So, as I say, there's work going on between us and the Treasury and MHCLG to work with local government to look at how we can manage the impacts of DSG deficits on finances and what will happen when the override comes to an end in 2026. I can't tell you definitively what the outcome of those conversations with MHCLG and the Treasury are going to be.
Right. Do you think it's really important that in doing that there is a fairness in the outcomes that are achieved, a fairness to the local authorities that surely can't make cuts to other services to fund this cross-service provision, but also a fairness to authorities who haven't had to go for an override, who, if the Treasury simply write them off, effectively you will have been given extra schools grants to some authorities, not for others, simply because of this situation.
Yes, and I think that the combination of those two fairnesses is why this is an issue that is going to take some thinking and work.
Right. And where will that decision be reported to and scrutinised?
I think the answer to that depends a little bit on what the decision is. So it'll sit with committees in other parts of Parliament, depending a little bit on the answer that is found, I think. But I mean, it's certainly something we would expect to be asked questions about in this committee once the decision's been made, and I would expect the Education Select Committee would take a view as well.
So I'm just going to come in there because this is one of the most important aspects of this entire hearing. A rural authority like mine that's well run and that is balancing its books through this mechanism has had its reserves run down something terrific. And so they're going to be in a very powerless position going forward because of this issue. So I think how it's dealt with in 2026 is going to be really, really important, because at the moment you're penalising authorities that have got decent reserves. The others have just had a Section 114 notice and had to have called in the commissioners. So, I mean, this is putting the whole local government sector at risk over this whole matter.
Yes, and as I say, I think the description that was given of the need to be fair, both to recognise the challenge for those who have got deficits and to recognise that we don't want to penalise those who have managed their budgets very carefully or who have managed this through reserves, I think is challenging. We're going to have to think about that very carefully, and again, both Treasury and MHCLG colleagues will be alive to that. I think it's also worth saying that we aren't just waiting, so we're continuing to do the work through the safety valve and the Delivering Better Value programme, and we have seen improvements in levels of deficit in both Safety Valve and Delivering Better Value authorities, and we've seen that achieved, and I think this is incredibly important to say, by helping them to serve children and young people better upstream rather than by diminishing the service given.
Can I just appeal to you not to leave this matter till 2026, because local authorities
No, we won't.
The sooner they know what they're doing, the better.
Could I just ask you,
yeah, of course.
Are you putting any extra resources into those authorities in the meantime?
Yes, so the Safety Valve programme focuses on the local authorities with the very highest levels of deficits, and the total Safety Valve budget is over 1.2 billion, of which about 750 million has already been paid out, and essentially it works on the basis of reaching an agreement with the authority to help to bring down their deficit in exchange for funding for a plan that allows them to move more work upstream, to do more in mainstream, and to avoid high cost. And the Delivering Better Value programme is similar, but is for the next tranche of local authorities who have slightly lower deficits, and it involves a slightly smaller amount of funding. And we have some really good examples of the work that has been done both through Safety Valve and through Delivering Better Value. So in Delivering Better Value, for example, I could talk about the work that Oldham have done, their timeliness for 20-week statutory thresholds has risen to 83%. They've developed an early years toolkit to look at transitions and help people move. They're using a universal screening tool to identify children in Year 5 who might struggle during the transition into secondary school. And through the combination of those things, they're supporting more children in mainstream, and they're bringing down their deficit, and that's funded by the Delivering Better Value work.
That's only available to councils which have got into the statutory override in the first place.
It is, but we're replicating the things that we're learning through Safety Valve and Delivering Better Value through the Change programme. And I think, one of the things I would say
extra resources in those cases.
So the Change programme does come with some extra resource, but also with support to implement those approaches that work. And we've put another $1 billion into the high needs budget this year through the budget, and we're encouraging local authorities to look at the lessons from Safety Valve, Delivering Better Value and the Change programme as they spend that money to try and pull it further upstream.
Rebecca Paul.
Thank you. I'd just like to declare an interest. I'm a county councillor, county council. With respect to the safety valve arrangements, I obviously understand why you've put that in place, but it feels a little bit of a sticking plaster, and I'm not sure how conducive it is in terms of delivering improvements into our SEND provision. I can see that you're looking to do a qualitative review in terms of the outcomes based on that, but what are your thoughts on that? What are your expectations with that? Are we going to see a decrease in EHCPs being issued as a result of local authorities being encouraged effectively to issue less in order to meet the efficiencies that have been set in the safety valve agreement.
So the aim isn't to reducing EHCPs isn't the goal. Meeting more people's needs more quickly is the goal. But we do find that when authorities do that, it does help them to manage the budget, because when you let needs go later, they become more expensive. So again, we've got really good examples from safety valve. We talk about Blackpool, who are developing more resource provisions in SEND in mainstream settings, which again provide really good quality support, but at lower cost than special school or independent, particularly than independent special school places. And they've redesigned their SEND support service, giving more training to mainstream schools, increasing their capacity, and they've had positive feedback on that from both schools and parents. So they're increasing the confidence of parents in the mainstream offer because they're skilling staff up more effectively, and they're doing that using their safety valve funding and in pursuit of their safety valve plan.
I think we'll just need to see that review, won't we, so that we can sort of see
Yes.
that and see the data that supports that, but thank you.
You've got a terrific fund, Ms. Acland-Hood, of examples of good practice. What I'm just hoping beneath the scenes is that you're pushing that out to all authorities so that they can learn from those that have got the best practice. But I don't want a great long answer. Nesl Kalliskin.
Thank you very much, Chair. And just a way of declaration, I was a council leader for a number of years and on the LGA board. And it will be no surprise to panel members that, as already recognised, the cost of SEND is the thing that will tip hundreds of local authorities over the edge in the coming months. It is by far, alongside perhaps adult social care, the single biggest pressure, not just in terms of the spend itself, but also associated costs through transport. And I wanted to ask about transport costs because it isn't always included in the underlying budgetary pressure of a local authority when it comes to SEND, but there is a particular pressure. Now there is a mixed picture, I think, across the country, but for some local authorities, when they talk about the SEND budget pressures, they're talking about the transport cost. And what that means is children who are placed on buses who have to make a journey of over an hour, and the cost of that journey has gone up, I think, in something like 74% in the last 5 years. I wanted to ask panel members how departments are responding to that in particular, and to what extent we're able to help curb that pressure, that cost pressure, in the short term, because of course creating additional space in mainstream takes time.
Thank you. Let me come in on that. So, as you say, the transport for children and young people with SEND is a really critical part of the overall system that supports them in terms of their educational provision. What we have seen is a very significant increase overall in the costs of home school transport. It obviously sits outside the high needs budget. It sits within local government finance settlement more widely. And what we've seen is a growth from 2015 of 0.9 billion to 1.7 billion overall in the home to school transport budget, but within that a growth from 0.6 billion to 1.3 billion in terms of the element that supports children and young people with SEND, and that's a 77% real terms increase. It's a very significant step forward. When we look at it, we see a number of different drivers. There are aspects of the costs which are related to the sort of changing cost of transport elements locally, things like the sort of support for passenger assistance, transport operators, supporting drivers' fuel price. But actually, the biggest drivers are essentially around the way in which we're seeing more children essentially travelling further to their provision as it's being placed forward. There's a number of things here we're doing. We've worked closely with local authorities to both understand the pressures that are coming forward. We're doing, in fact, back to the conversation about data, we are also seeking to gather better data on this. At the moment, we have expenditure data, but we don't have good granular data in terms of actually the nature of the different types of school transport. So we've just announced a sort of further survey on it. We've updated our statutory guidance, giving local authorities much greater support in terms of actually some of that decision making and how they're working through the sets of questions with parents and in their local area. We're working with local authorities on best practice, so we have a bi-monthly meeting where we're working with the the transport and the send teams within local authorities in terms of the way they're thinking about organising local transport. Some of it is about buses, as you say, but a lot of it is also being grown significantly by the use of taxis and individual transport, which does mean that you've got fewer economies of scale. So thinking about ways in which current transport is organised. But longer term, we will look to some of the wider reform conversation we've been having here about how do we try and make sure that children and young people's needs are being met in schools that are within their local communities and which has less of a transport requirement on them. But as you say, in the short term, it's also really important we continue to make progress in terms of that best practice in the system as well.
And it is the case, isn't it, that the cost of a high needs block in a mainstream school is a fraction of the price per head than what it might cost to send a child to a special school in the private sector.
Yes.
So it is much better in terms of value for money for the taxpayer to support our mainstream schools so that they can adequately meet the need of children in terms of send.
Yes, again, I think it's subject to being clear that there will be some needs that will always need to be met in a specialist setting. So again, I'm just very careful about not implying that we think literally any need can be well met in a mainstream school. But we do see needs that are well met in mainstream in some places and not so much in others. And in that case, we do tend to see much lower costs for meeting needs in mainstream and similar or better outcomes.
And if I can, please, Chair, also ask about head teachers, teachers and teaching assistants, because there was quite some detail that you gave us around the need for additional data gathering and understanding. Although I might say I think there is already quite a lot of data that tells us the system is broken, and I'm not suggesting you disagree with that, but I think we know that it's not working. Like many members of Parliament, I visit schools on a regular basis, and the conversations I have with teachers, head teachers and teaching assistants is pretty much the same when it comes to SEND provision. I wondered what you have been told by educators about the need for the support in schools at the moment. What is your understanding about what they think should happen so that SEND is better provided for in our mainstream schools?
Thank you. So you're absolutely right. I mean, this is very near the top of the issues that are raised whenever I go out into schools and whenever I speak to teachers and heads. And I would say there isn't a completely homogenous view. So, I mean, there's a lot of people in the sector and I talk to lots of them and they have different views on many of these things, but there are some really common themes that come through. So I think the first is the sense that the profile of need is changing rapidly and it's quite difficult to keep up. There's definitely real interest in and enthusiasm for support to help teachers meet more needs more confidently, and we've got survey evidence on teachers' confidence in meeting special educational needs. Interestingly, they tend to do better when asked about their knowledge than about their confidence. So some of it is about supporting people with content training, and actually some of it is about making sure they understand that they probably know a bit more than they
like
think they do.
Workforce development.
Yes. So again, as Juliet said, we've revised the whole of the early initial teacher training and early career framework to include more content on adaptive teaching, on supporting pupils with SEND, including content on things like how to make effective use of specialist technology to support pupils with SEND. And we're also enhancing requirements on providers of training for early career teachers to make sure they're exemplifying. So when they use examples and test that they're using examples that reflect how their content applies to pupils with SEND. We have a thing called the Universal SEND Services Programme, which provides continuing professional development to school and FE workforce. A lot of that is online training that people can take whenever they like. We've seen very large numbers of take-ups of our units on topics like speech, language and communication needs, on supporting sensory differences. The contract also offers autism training, which over 200,000 professionals have undertaken. And then we've got the SENCO support, which so the introduction of the SENCO MPQ, which Juliet spoke about, which is being very well taken up, including by people who aren't SENCOs. And that's in addition to the early years SENCO, which was referred to earlier, where I will just say this actually, the report says we didn't meet our target. We said we wanted to fund up to 7,000 spaces. That wasn't ever a target. That was to make sure we could pick that up, and we've seen more than 4,000 people complete, and we expect to see that figure go up significantly. We did see more than 7,000 people sign up for it as well. So the appetite for training is really strong. I think the second thing I would say is that teachers and heads say they've seen less of the kind of support around and outside the school that helps them to meet need well, and they repeat back the analysis from the Green Paper that says you have got this vicious cycle where there's more and more of the resources going in to meet very high-end individually specified need through plans, and that leaves less resource available. So, for example, access to speech and language therapy around the school, and ability to plan for and meet, as it were, cohort-based needs. So we're in a place now where it would be very reasonable for almost any school to say, we know that in any year we're going to have a reasonable number of children coming through our gate who have speech and language need, ASD, SEMH. Let's make cohort-based provisions so that we can meet that need rather than waiting for the individual identification child by child in order to be able to attract penny packets of funding. And so that desire for a more kind of cohort-based approach is quite strong, I would say, and not universally, but I hear that quite a lot. And then I do hear frustration on waiting times and on the things that it's not possible to get unless you have a plan, as well as around some of the funding. And I would also say most schools think that other schools are not taking their share of children with special educational needs and disabilities.
Yes. And just very, very quickly, just finally on that point of the frustration from head teachers and teachers for those children that do need a plan in place that can't get it. We've heard a lot about. If I might just take the opportunity, Chair, just to identify that my constituency of Barking, 14% of people get their EHCP within the 20-week period. Not a week goes past without me contacted, but by a parent who is at breaking point, who describes to me the process of trying to fight for a plan for their child. It is the job of a parent to do the best they can for their child, but at the moment, the system means they are fighting against it, and it is causing a huge amount of stress and anxiety, and it is too often the very families that need the most support that are finding themselves not able to get the plan they need for their child. I know that you recognise that, but I felt it was very, very important to say, given that my constituency has one of the lowest figures in the whole country for parents being able to get their children with a plan in place.
Can I just come in on that question? I mean, this is a really good point, I think, that Alison makes. The whole system seems to be so adversarial for parents just to try and get the best provision for their children. I mean, what can we do to make it less adversarial?
I do think it all comes back to making it easier to get provision without having to go through an individualised plan-seeking process for many, many more types of need. Because, as I say, one of the challenges is that the 2014 system set up this incredibly clear entitlement if you have a plan, and a much kind of vaguer commitment if you don't. So it's rational to chase plans, and indeed, I mean, the single biggest determinant of whether you have an EHCP or not when you control for other characteristics is the school you attend. Some schools seek plans much more than others, and the question of kind of the plan being the route to having your need met, the principal route to having your need met, I think is going to have to be something that we, with ministers, look at, because there are clear groups of needs which we know are going to come through the system in large numbers, and we could set ourselves up much better to deliver provision that meets many, many more of those needs without people having to go through a process in order to get them.
Thank you, Nizzle. Luke Charteris.
Thank you. I'll just ask around the future funding model, and if you look at the NEO report 1.12, it goes into some detail about the current figures. So it costs £61,500 per pupil to send them to an independent school, and you were around a third less in a mainstream secondary school, or £23,900 in a state special school. How can we move away from expensive independent provision in a future model to actually better value for money when we look at the state sector, who are doing some inspirational work?
Yes, and I think this goes, again, if you look back at the both the 2022 Green Paper and the implementation plan, it identifies that challenge, and it talks both about trying to meet more need in mainstream and both trying to free up space in maintain special and create more space in maintain special, so that there's less need to rely on expensive independent special school provision. That continues to be something that we are committed to and working on really hard as part of the implementation plan.
And are you holding local authorities individually to account on this?
So we do look at differences between different local authorities, and we do see significant variation in the extent to which local authorities will place in mainstream and specialist and in independent non-maintained. And we've also got, I mentioned earlier, the capacity collection we do, which looks at capacity available in specialist places. We've invested significantly in capital funding to local authorities, which is now driven by that capacity collection to enable them to build more specialist places, and that's both in special schools and in units and resource provision in mainstream schools. But I would say, again, it's important that we look both at how we hold individual local authorities to account and that we take accountability and think about how the whole system is working and what the drivers are that have caused that shift over time too.
Okay, sure. I'll just pivot in the interest of time, Chair. On Friday I met Ken Merry. He's the Chief Exec of York College. They're doing some great work there. He shared one example I do want to share. Before a child, when they were in Year 11, their EHCP plan was for one-to-one provision, and because of a post-16 review, that had actually changed to a part-time 1-to-3 provision. So it was a 9 times reduction in the amount of support they were getting from literally July through to September. So I just wondered if you felt, as I do, that perhaps local authorities have a perverse incentive to reduce the amount of support when you're reaching that sort of critical post-16 threshold, and if you've sort of seen any trends in this area.
I can't say I've seen particular trends in that area. I mean, we do encourage people to review plans regularly and look at the level of support provided, and I can't comment on an individual. I mean, I can't comment on an individual case. I mean, I would say that the EEF's evidence says that straight one-to-one models of support are often not the best for children and young people's outcomes, because they can sometimes result in that one-to-one support effectively not encouraging the child to do independent work. So, very crudely, in the worst case scenario, the TA does the work and the child watches. So the EEF's evidence would say your best use of a teaching assistant to support a young person with special educational needs is small group, well-specified, well-evidenced, targeted programmes. I have no idea if that is what is happening in this case, and I couldn't possibly comment on it without understanding it better. But I do think there's something about not assuming that the ratio of support is the thing that defines whether it's good or not.
Do you think local authorities have an incentive and have been actively reducing support when EHCPs have been reviewed on purpose due to financial constraints?
I've got no evidence of that.
You happy? Thank you, Luke. Anna Dixon, please.
Yes, thank you. I guess just to echo the points that Luke has made, that I do think the public would be quite shocked to learn both the total of £2 billion that's being spent currently by local authorities on independent schools. We've heard a lot about the challenges that local governments are facing, but indeed, this differential in cost of the independent school placements and those in the state sector, whether that be in mainstream or in state specialist schools. And so I would just underline the need for greater assurance, really, that those fees can be justified, and also just to see if there is any consistency at all across local authorities. So really just to sort of press on that matter as to what further work you can be doing as a department and indeed with other departmental colleagues to really make sure that we're getting value for money out of the independent sector. I don't know if there's anything you would wish to add to that.
And that, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth saying there are, independent special schools can play a key role in the system where there is particular needs, low incidence needs, but as you've described, the kind of significant growth in numbers suggests a very high cost now in terms of the reliance on the independent special sector. And so as part of the improvement plan, we'd started to work around things like the role of bans and tariffs, to think about what models that would essentially recognise cost in the system and to think about that. We will need to work through with ministers where they will want to be in relation to that. Nothing's ruled in or out at this point, but clearly thinking about national standards and being really clear that where there is where provision is offered, that it's in line with expectations and that it's part of that local pattern and that it's good value for money.
One of the things that seems to be in part driving the demand for EHCPs is the lack of requirement, particularly on academy trusts, and any statutory powers that the local authority has over academies in taking children just generally with SEND support. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about some of the trends around EHCPs and academies, and whether there needs to be more powers given to local authorities in relation to academy trusts to accept SEN, and somehow rebalance this individualising of plans versus the general support. Again, looking to Juliet.
It's worth clarifying, local authorities can apply to the Secretary of State to direct an academy through their funding order in terms of making sure that they're
very convoluted process, and talking to directors of children's services, that adds further to the weight that parents are having to go, and that uncertainty from parents that I know where they've had an initial placement for a secondary school place, that mainstream school has then said we can't meet that child's needs, and often that's then tipping because the level of delay to go through that convoluted process with no certainty of outcome is often meaning they're taking that EHCP either to the independent sector, thus pushing up those costs, or to specialist schools. So it's a very long and unsatisfactory process. So is there any solution to that other than going through a long and arduous process of direction?
Yeah, I think a couple of different things here. One, obviously, the wider incentives, which we've talked a bit about in terms of actually recognising schools and trusts that are absolutely performing and delivering really excellent quality mainstream inclusive support, and the role of Ofsted in the way they're looking at kind of putting greater emphasis on inclusion as part of that, I think is quite material in terms of actually the way in which schools and trusts will be recognised for that work. We are looking through the, and it was said in the King's speech, through the Children's Wellbeing Bill, at the role of local authorities and the powers they have around admissions and place planning, and the sort of duty to cooperate in this space, which is obviously a critical part of the system overall.
Thank you. And just finally, is there any data on refusals to admit this idea, and by school type and local authority, and any data on that number of appeals that have been going to the Secretary of State, and again how many of those have been upheld, just to get a handle on that process? What data do you hold?
I haven't got the data with me today, but when a local authority will apply to the Secretary of State to direct an individual school or trust, we involve the school's adjudicator, so we will have essentially that in terms of looking at different numbers of cases.
Follow up with the committee with that data, please.
Well done, Anna. Thank you. We now come to Clive, please.
Right.
Or it's Sarah first. Sorry, Sarah.
Sorry, yes,
Sarah first. Sarah Green. Sorry about that.
Sarah Hall, the other one.
The other one.
Right, okay, thank you. I'm going to declare an interest as well. I was the Cabinet Member for Children's Services in Warrington for about 3 years, so know a little bit about this subject. And I know how frustrated families and carers have been, and particularly with the wait for the outcome of the SEN review. There's a lot of hopes pinned on what that would look like. For me, having spoken to so many families locally, I know this is one of the most critical issues at the moment. There's a huge amount of frustration from families who just don't think the right support is there, who don't think that there is a consistency of support, that there is not enough cross-departmental working between health, education, and even the local authority. Which I've also witnessed myself. It does happen, not everywhere, but it does happen. And it starts from even the kind of waiting for an assessment. So even before you get assessed, it's whether you should have an assessment. And, your children are facing kind of almost paper sifts before they get to that point, which I find baffling. So my question is to Susan and Jonathan. Why did it take so long to develop the 2023 SEN improvement plan? given that significant problems were recognised as early as 2019?
Yes, and I'll start on that because it's a joint improvement plan, but I think that's our accountability. So the SEND review was launched in September 2019, recognising at that point some of the challenges with the implementation of the 2014 reforms. Essentially, through 2020 and the first part of 2021, we had to divert a lot of resource from more or less everything in the department that wasn't pandemic related to the pandemic, and that is part of the answer. In summer 2021, we were starting to share drafts of what would eventually become the Green Paper. And it was clear, so we didn't remove all resource from it, we did keep working on it, but it was slower than it would have been. And it became clear that the work that had been done didn't take into account the context change that the pandemic itself had brought about. So again, when you look at some of the increases in need, you see another enormous shift through that pandemic period. And we were still in it in summer 2021, and the position was still shifting. And so as we started to consult with stakeholders on it across summer 2021, they were saying, we aren't quite sure if this gets the new context that we're coming out into, and we think you need to spend some more time on it. And so we didn't push a draft out in summer 2021. We paused and we listened to that feedback that we were getting from stakeholders, and that's why the Green Paper wasn't published until the beginning of 2022. So it was effectively going back round with a group of stakeholders who were giving us feedback on our emerging drafts and saying to us, the combination of the pandemic and the other things that have happened means you need to think about this differently. And then from the publication of the Green Paper in 2022, it was a question of trying to make sure that we were really consulting widely and listening. And I might have said this to committee before. One of the bees I have in my bonnet as a senior civil servant is that I think that the traditional government consultation document is a terrible thing, and we should try and stop doing it. I think it results in feedback from the usual suspects and doesn't allow us to go and talk to the people who are most affected. So we did do a traditional government consultation document because the legislative framework requires it, and it's really important. And I honour those people who did respond to it, and I make no comment about the people who did respond to it. But we didn't want that to be our only consultation. We wanted to make sure we were going out and talking to parents, to children, and to really hearing from the widest possible range of voices. So we were running very large spectrum webinars, we were trying to bring people in, we were talking to representative groups, we were trying to hear the voices of people who wouldn't necessarily reply to a traditional consultation product, and that took a bit of time. And so you then saw the publication of the improvement plan in March. Again, I don't want to rely on this too hard, and I don't think it sort of does, but we also did have an element of ministerial churn over that period. So there were also some parts of that period where we were making sure that where we had new ministers, they were comfortable with the journey we'd been on and what we were doing and moving that through. I won't say more about that, but...
Okay. So, I mean, given that longevity, given that length of time, what impact do you think that's had on children with SEND now?
So I think that it's completely understandable that people feel frustrated that it took a long time. The one thing I will say is that we were not sitting on our hands and not taking other action during that period. So many of the things we've talked about during this hearing on, for example, the changes we've made to initial teacher training and the early career frame, that what we've done on universal provision, the development of programmes like the partnerships between university and schools, the LSEC programme, the investment in Nelly, and all of the work that we do individually with local authorities, both through delivering better value safety valve and through the change programme, and indeed through our the day-to-day work of our regions group colleagues who go and work with local authorities through a range of stages of intervention. It wasn't that we weren't continuing to try and act and improve on the lived experience while we were doing that work. It was just that we felt that we needed to take a more radical look at the system alongside the day-to-day work of improvement. So I really recognise and hear the frustration of people who felt like it took a long time, and it did. But we weren't
what do you think in terms of good, in terms of the ultimate, you know, the end product, the perfect product? I mean, what does good look like, and how will you review that, keep that under review? I mean, we know that if we look at, you know, ADHD and autism, that we are identifying a lot of girls and women now. The diagnosis process is changing, and we're realising that it's a bigger there's bigger scope than we realised before at different presentations. So how is that? What does that look like in the future?
So I think I'd actually start from the from parents' perception that their children are getting the support they need in the system. I think that is a really important metric for us, and I think we should recognise that parents are quite good judges of whether their children are getting well supported. And so if you ask me to pick a single metric for our success, it would be an increase in that proportion of parents that say that their children's needs are being well met in the system. I think we also want to see continued improvement in outcomes of all kinds, and I spoke at the beginning of the hearing about the kind of range of outcomes that I think is well set out in the Zone Code of Practice. I think the other thing I would say is I do think there's something quite important about, and I know we keep coming back to this, but the ability to meet a much wider range of need in the mainstream system by making it more inclusive without asking people to go through a process. And that's particularly important in relation to a set of conditions which are effectively spectrum conditions. So ASD used to be seen as a kind of discrete, so it used to be described as autism, it used to be seen as a kind of you have it or you don't have it condition. It is now really widely recognised that it is a spectrum condition. And so it's not susceptible to a kind of yes or no diagnostic process. It's much more susceptible to an understanding that there's a range of responses that you will see in the normal distribution of the population.
I think our understanding as a population as well. So I've got ADHD, and that understanding that, you know, that we are, you know, we have different strengths, we may work in a different way, but actually, you know, it's not the same for everybody, but for a lot of us, being in that mainstream environment is incredibly important. But that doesn't mean to say, you know, in terms of the classes and the changes that are coming forwards, that needs to be reflected, I think. But I absolutely agree with parents' feedback as well. I think that's the number one thing, and I think it needs to be under constant review as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hall. We've got 3 Sarahs on this committee, so it's all a bit confusing. So thank you very much, Sarah H. Yes, indeed. Clive Betts.
Yes. Serious issues. When the 2023 improvement plan was drawn up, apparently there were 136 internal actions, but the NAO, when looking at this, said there wasn't a fully developed implementation plan reflecting the interdependencies between different proposals and how much they would cost. Have you addressed that? Fairly fundamental criticism.
Have a go at that? Yeah, thank you. So, as the committee is aware, our improvement plan was published in March 2023, almost a year after the Green Paper, following the consultation period that Susan's described. And that very long list of commitments within it, which we shared with and discussed with the NAO as they were carrying out their review, contained quite a range of actions on different time frames. So, for example, it referred to the change programme that we've talked about quite a lot today, which we were at that point seeking to get underway very quickly to test some of the component reforms that we'd explored in those documents. And it also had some sort of longer term areas of interest and aspiration, which we've also discussed today, such as looking more closely at the relationship with independent special schools. So within that long list, there was quite a bit of variation in terms of how those were being approached and how they fitted together. And with the ministers we had at the time, we identified those for the most kind of urgent focus. And an example was those measures pointed at post-16 transition, which we've also talked about today. We subsequently had a review by the government internal audit agency, which found that our arrangements around monitoring and tracking progress against them was broadly effective. I think it's a fair observation, though, that there was undoubtedly more we could do, and this is something we'll learn from as we put a new programme in place with going forward with our current ministers, around really understanding the interdependencies of all those measures and crucially, as you say, also understanding the costs associated with them, where we're hoping that they may achieve effective savings to the system, when those will fall, and being really clear what our assumptions are.
There's some other comments from the NAO which I found quite worrying, that the department couldn't say what progress had been made on implementing specific commitments. It did not have clear processes to understand the potential unlikely outcomes and benefits of its interventions. In other words, he thought the interventions were a good idea, but he couldn't really then go on and prove what was happening. That it should be clearer on how proposal would lead to benefits. Isn't that pretty fundamental? You can have all the best plans in the world. If you don't actually know what they're going to achieve, it's not much use having them, is it?
I agree that it's fundamental. And I think, I would say that some of the actions set out in the improvement plan were about testing. And I think another thing that the NAO report brings out really clearly is the importance of absolutely understanding the consequences of any interventions before you switch them on nationally. So there's probably a distinction within that very long list of actions about those which we were sort of putting into place regardless, and those which we were testing, for example, through our change programme. I think there's always more we can do to have really strong arrangements in place to monitor these particularly quite complex overall sets of actions that we're testing. And I think the other really relevant point here is another factor observed in the NAO report, which is around some of the really complex levers and drivers, shared responsibilities sitting with different actors in the system, not all of which are within DfE's remit. So that's absolutely not an excuse for not having really, really clear tracking, cost-benefit analysis, and a process for measuring whether we're succeeding. But I think it does reflect the complexity of some of that very extensive programme set out in the improvement plan.
But it also said the report that you've got the benefits dashboard, and where you were tracking some of the key proposals, I think the latest tracking information is only 12 were actually on track out of the I think 20, nearly 37 benefits that were identified. Only 12. So the plan's there, not quite clear what benefits it's going to provide. When you do the assessment of that, many of them are failing. So where's the improvement?
So I absolutely take on board that feedback about, this is urgent. We've had delays even to get the Green Paper and the improvement plan on board, and we know that for families and lots of others in the system, demonstrating these improvements quickly is really important, so I absolutely acknowledge that. I would say that dashboards, for example, were an example of something that we described in the improvement plan as something that we would be testing through the change programme in terms of their efficacy and actually holding various players in the system to account and driving behaviour change. So in a way, we can learn something from how difficult or easy it was to get them online.
Can learn what's failing?
Well, we can learn where actually some of the some things may not be as straightforward for local areas to implement, for example, as we might have hoped. I would also say, Susan referred to lots of work that has very much gone on since the improvement plan, despite obviously the general election and change in ministerial team, and again, without wanting to rely on that too heavily, there may be some examples of where our initial trajectory had to change because of that factor, but it's all still very much extremely useful learning, as we've heard, working very much jointly, particularly on that example with local authorities, that we will be taking forward into our new programme.
Two quick follow-ups. I mentioned, Permanent Secretary, the issue of the responsibilities sometimes been joint between your department and Department of Health. Is that really working, or are the things that need to be sorted out there fairly fundamentally at a very senior level?
I think both things can be true. I think fundamentally it is working, and some things need to be sorted out at a very senior level, but where we have things that need to be sorted out at a very senior level, we meet and talk and sort them out at a very senior level. I mean, I'll invite Juliet to talk a little bit more about the governance, because it goes to the point about how we're addressing some of those things that weren't going as fast as we wanted them to go, and how we're bringing in the cross-government governance.
So I think two reflections. One would be, I think, when you look at those benefits, part of the challenges, I think, are recognition that actually the improvement plan just didn't go far enough. That actually, to be able to genuinely realise those benefits, we needed to essentially take some of the approaches we've been describing in this hearing in terms of going further and understanding the sort of levers and incentives around inclusive mainstream, looking more deeply at the ways in which actually local authorities were finding that without some of the levers they needed, that it was challenging to meet some of their responsibilities. So I think it is probably, if you track back to some of those benefits, actually some of the actions were absolutely right and appropriate, but nevertheless not sufficient in the context of the scale of the challenge. Definitely coming back to the question of cross-government working, I spend a lot of time talking to Jonathan. Absolutely, the join up with health is critical to this. It's critical both through our overall opportunity mission, where actually the health and education contribution to a range of outcomes through the system are central, but particularly in the context of SEND. I've established a cross-government board. Jonathan's colleagues are a key part of that. We will need to work very closely, and HSE colleagues are also part of that.
I think we may have a question for Jonathan on this before we're finished.
Just say, I ought to declare I'm Vice President of the Local Government Association, but if we went to the LGA and said, have you been listened to, or are things changing in your view, so you've actually got more ability to deal with these issues at local level, would they say yes?
I think they would. I think they'd particularly say yes on the so what they have been saying to us is exactly as Juliet says, the things in the implementation plan are sensible and would be good things to do, but they don't go far enough. And I mean, as the NAO report says, they would say we need to look more fundamentally at some of the big levers across the system. And the ISOS report that was published in the summer, which was sponsored by the LGA, was a really helpful contribution and is something that we are looking at really carefully with ministers as we shape the next phase of this. So I think they'd say, yes, we have been listened to, and yes, some sensible things are happening, but the implementation plan didn't go far enough, and we're now having conversations with the department that show that they recognise that we need to go further in the next phase.
Jonathan Marron, going back to the point about the relationships between health and education at a local level. We've got the integrated care boards now established in the health service. Is engagement there appropriate? Is it good, or is the ICB so focused on other things in health that this is an issue that isn't really anywhere near the top of their priorities?
Look, I think we're working to make sure that our ICBs are focused on this issue. So one of the things we did in 2023 was make sure that every ICB appointed an executive director that was responsible for SEND to really get that better working with the local authority, the education system locally. So I think we have taken those actions. Clearly, there's a challenge to deliver the health services to the range of children and their needs, both for SEND and broader health, that we continue to focus on, work on. We have made significant investments in resource over this period, but we have, as we've been discussing in this committee, seen very significant increases in needs. So we continue to work on that. Lord Darcy's report, which colleagues may have seen, identifies this as an area where this significant challenge. The department is working on a 10-year plan to see recovery of the NHS. It probably will take us that time to see a full recovery, but we're trying to see immediate progress.
You looked at ICB's current plans. Would everyone have this issue as one of their top priorities?
The planning guidance last year asked them to look at their access to community health services, which obviously speech and language, some of the services. So you might not see it as SEND, but I would certainly expect that you would see a focus on mental health services for children and young people and for community health services in all of their plans.
Anna's got an urgent
just a very brief sort of probing on this, if I may, Jonathan. In Bradford District, there are 7,000 children on CAMS waiting lists. You haven't, be specific about CAMS. Some are waiting up to 4 years for an assessment for ADHD and ASD. And anecdotally, there are some areas where we're talking 8 years for a child. So when you're talking more generally about, community health services, can you be specific, please, about how those CAMS waiting times are going to come down sooner than 10 years?
I think there was very significant waiting for CAMS across the country. I think in the last 3 months period, 130,000 children were seen for a first time. Of those seen, the median wait is 20 days. So the high priority children being pushed through. There are another 300,000 waiting still on that list at the end of that period, where much longer median wait times amongst those children. So we have a very significant challenge in making sure that our children and young people get access to services. Now, we have been investing in CAMS. I think I said at the beginning, the mental health spend over this period is up from 11 to 17 billion, 40% increase in staff. We've been working to try and put more mental health services into schools. So I think we now have nearly 500 schools-based mental health teams covering about 40% of the school population. Obviously, the government has got a commitment to take that to all children. So I think we've been trying to find both ways of boosting our existing services and to find new ways of finding new services that might help children earlier on. And then I think, as I said earlier, that some of these services are really very challenged, and we're looking again at just what our model is. I think ADHD being the one where actually it's currently out. We've got a task force looking at that because actually we're not really sure what the right answer is.
Marron, I think this is a complex subject, this issue of waiting lists, but it's absolutely critical. And Anna's right. In my area, it's very long waiting lists. And I suspect the two of us are not by any means alone. Could you let the committee have a note on this, a specific action for you, please? Thank you. Could we then come to Peter Fortune, who's been waiting very patiently throughout the committee? Peter.
Who says I've been patient? So I think it actually builds on what Jonathan was talking about there, because throughout this session we've seen that the real challenge, especially to local authorities, is that pressure and that increasing demand. So in terms of the forward planning and the cost, what are you doing to make a plan to deal with this whilst having an efficient SEN service over the next 5, 10, 15 years? And as a second to that, and Susan, I guess I'll come to you with this, is what are you doing to support local authorities in terms of managing those pressures?
Thank you. So I think the forward plan is partly about that kind of forward projection, but as I say, it's got to be in tandem with working very hard to try to recognise that if what we're seeing is a profound shift, not just in incidents but in our understanding of some of this need, that recognising that relatively higher incidence and understanding through our mainstream system has got to be a really important part of that, and that will help us both to serve people better and to manage the costs more effectively. In terms of the things we're doing to help local authorities manage costs now, I've talked a little bit about the kind of two key programmes we have for doing that in areas where there's specific deficit-related challenges. So that's the Safety Valve programme and the Delivering Better Value programme. But we are also working through all of our kind of good practice sharing through the Change programme and other means, because local authorities are acutely aware that the cost challenge is real. We've also obviously been investing significantly increasing sums of money in this. So the latest budget increase invested an additional £1 billion in the high needs budget for 25-26, which takes it to a total of 11.9 billion. That's a 7% real terms increase on last year. Builds on successive increases in each of the previous 3 years. But I think the kind of the challenge is that we need to make sure we're using that funding. We as a whole system need to make sure we're using that funding as efficiently, as effectively as possible. Not in order to penny pinch, but in order to get the best possible service to children. Because we've seen funding go up by spectacularly more than we've seen outcomes improved by.
Yeah. So it's a combination there of understanding the causes, but then also ensuring there's value for money at the point of delivery. Yes. Because I was looking at the school census data from 2024 specific to my borough, and this is sort of one of those things that can be a real shock to the financial system. Is we've got somewhere in the region of 1,200 young people in Bromley independent schools who are having some sort of SEN provision, but of them only I think 3/4 of them don't have a plan. When you looked at London, there's about 30,000 children having special educational needs provision, and of them 4/5 don't have a plan, about 24,000, 25,000 children. So if you think about some of the changes that may happen in terms of that independent sector, both this year and next year, and then some that may not ever enter the sector at all, that's an example of a potential huge financial wave that can hit the system. Is there any work going on about that?
I think you're talking about the risk that there are children who are currently having needs met in independent schools who may move into the state sector as a result of VAT changes. Is that the question? Yeah. So, I mean, overall about 6% of the children in the country are educated in independent schools. Our best estimate of the impact is that we will see some but relatively small flows into the state-maintained sector. Where we have children whose needs are sufficient that they should be funded by the local authority through a plan, obviously the local authority doesn't pay that, so that doesn't affect their place. And we aren't expecting to see particularly differential flows of those who are on SEND support compared to other children, no.
A low percentage you're expecting to apply for an EHCP?
We wouldn't expect them to. So, by and large, if you have a need that would be sufficient to get an EHCP, you're really strongly incentivised to do that already. I mean, the VAT is a fifth of the total cost. If you think you could get the whole of the cost made, you probably would have applied by now.
Well, yeah, that's sort of the point I'm thinking.
So I don't think we'll see significant increases in the EHCP. I mean, we might see people trying, but I'm not sure that...
Then it comes back to the 98%.
I'm not sure but that's 2.5% of the total go through the system that go to tribunal.
Thank you, Peter. Lloyd.
Thank you, Chair. Just one of the points that sort of stuck out for me in the NAO report was around this idea of insufficient capacity, and then it does go on to talk about what is being done to grow the number of places and the number of standalone schools as well. Mm-hmm. Would you be able to just perhaps set out in a bit more detail what is actually going on to build those extra schools where people aren't in a mainstream setting and are actually going to be in a special school setting? I only say this because I have got a very interesting example in my constituency. We've got an Osprey Key School site, which was, I believe, in 2019 first sort of given the green light by your department to be a standalone school for children with SEND, and yet we're still here now, and it hasn't opened, even though the school building was built in 2019. It still isn't operational. The reasons that were given in a note to me by the local council seem to be quite low level as to why these delays had gone on. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what your department is doing to work with local councils to actually make sure that where we've got places literally ready to go, that we're doing everything we can to get them over the line, to get these schools open for the next academic year. And for me, it seems that there's a little bit of a miscommunication or a slow working relationship between the department and local councils to get this done.
Thank you. I might turn to Alison in a minute on some of this. I mean, the starting point is, yes, we do work with local councils on the delivery of places. There are a set of different routes we use, and so the way we work with them depends a little bit on what route it has gone down. So we have... I said that we've been increasing the... in fact, I think Alison said that we've been increasing the amount we've been putting out through special needs capital, particularly over the last couple of years. And that has gone... Local authorities have some flexibility about whether they spend that on, for example, additional places in units or resource provision in mainstream schools or on building whole new schools. We also have seen significant numbers of special and AP places created through the free schools programme, and the free schools tend to be centrally delivered, whereas the ones that go out through the capacity-driven funding that goes to local authorities are delivered locally by the local authority, and we will be closer to those that are centrally delivered than to those that are delivered by the local authority. But we will, if there are blockages or difficulties, we can kind of talk to and support local authorities in that delivery.
Yeah, I mean, that would just be very helpful, because I think if that is one of the things that is actually stopping us getting schools open and additional places, it is quite minor barriers. I obviously do not expect you to have at your fingertips the specific example I've referred to of the Osprey Key School, but the note given to me said it was about a lease, a contract and a retaining wall. So these seem like quite low-level concerns that would lead to a school not opening and offering...
Right, can I suggest, rather than go back to what's on a constituency issue, that Ms. Acland, would you give us a note?
We can take away.
Ismail.
It's just that Alison, point around how we make sure that small barriers don't get in the way of a much bigger piece of delivery.
Right. We'll get a note. Thank you for raising that point. Thank you. Helen.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to come back to the question of delivery and monitoring of progress. So the NAO report that we've been considering today is really damning on the current state of the SEND system and the impact that that has for children and for families and for local authorities and for those working in education. And the discussion that we've had this afternoon has focused on initiatives and interventions that the department is already making in relation to that system. So I suppose just feeling some of the frustration that I think lots of parents and families and professionals working in the sector would feel listening to this discussion. Where does the substantive change that steps up to the challenges laid out in the report come from? Is it a case of just waiting to see on initiatives and interventions the department already has in train, or is there a bigger plan that is needed to address the scale of the challenges? And does the department fully comprehend and have a plan that is equal to the experience of the people that this report refers to, really in quite stark terms?
Thank you. So I will just say that I'm always really conscious when I appear before this committee that my role before this committee is to reflect and report on our delivery, not to talk about our future policy, because that is for ministers. So I will just say that. But I mean, what I would say is, as we reflect on the things that we've put in place so far, I think there are some things that we think are really positive, which we can learn from and we can build on. That's not to say I think that the current state of affairs is positive, but I think we are learning some things that we can put in place. And I would say the combination of the work we've done on safety valve delivering better value and the change programme has shown that we're right to think that another way is possible, that we should be focusing on inclusive mainstream, and that we can support young children and young people better and earlier and help to rebalance the system. We also have a set of specific evidence-based programmes to support schools that I think we should be doubling down on, things like LSEC, Nelly and the PINS programme that I've spoken about, which are really targeted on those areas where we see need growing. And I think the work that we've done to invest in workforce development is and will remain really important and needs to be built on and intensified. However, I also think that it's right that those people who've told us that the improvement plan didn't go far enough be listened to and attended to as we advise ministers on next steps. And the things that I would pick out that we're being told that we would be feeding into those conversations are, although the improvement plan talked about inclusive mainstream and did a set of things that went some way towards that, it did not look hard enough at the wider barriers and levers, and some of those have been raised by committee members today, including wider incentives on schools, that to some extent we didn't look hard enough at some of the accountability incentives, and ministers have already signalled really clearly that they want to look at those, as well as at things like curriculum barriers, which again we didn't look at in that implementation plan. The second is that local authorities told us that the plan and some of the work that we've been doing asked them to take responsibility for a much better and more consistent offer to those without EHCPs, without the levers to deliver all of that. And again, some of those points have been made in the committee today, and we are, again, ministers have signalled really clearly that they want to look at how we could go back round and think about how we make sure we've got the levers that are proportionate to the asks that we make. Parents told us that there wasn't enough clarity about what that ordinarily available provision, what that inclusive mainstream provision would look like, and that they needed that in order to feel confident that needs could be met in mainstream, and that in effect that might allow you to move away from reliance on plans for everything. And then, as I said earlier, schools told us that it continued to rely too much on a model that looked principally at individual needs rather than at making it easier for schools to provide for cohorts or groups of children in a more kind of predictable and predictive way, and that they could do more efficiently and more effectively if there was a better infrastructure of support around them in order to be able to meet those cohort needs. And then overall, I would say, putting that all together, I think we accept the NAO recommendation that says that it's important to take a really fundamental look at the system from end to end. And I think we did some of that in the improvement plan, but when you take those pieces of feedback from others, with ministers, we will be looking more comprehensively in the next phase. That's the question.
Okay, are you done?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Helen. That's really helpful. We now go to Nesl Kaliskan, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's a very quick question just on speech and language support. It's really, for Jonathan, from an NHS perspective, my understanding is it sits within the remit of the NHS to think about speech and language support and commissioning. There is a crisis in terms of the workforce and the number of individuals who are qualifying as speech and language therapists. I wondered what the NHS is doing to support a pipeline in that workforce, if anything.
So, look, a really important area. We've talked about the increasing demand repeatedly over the course of the day. Actually, we are trying to increase these. Over the last period, speech and language therapists in the NHS are at 7,419. It's a 20% increase on 2019, so we're making some progress. Clearly, I think there's much to do in order to get access to these services. And then I think the work that we're doing with education on can we make specialist support available early in school, so the PIN scheme and the LSEC scheme, I think are really looking, can we use the specialist skills that we have in the most effective way? Can we help schools to feel confident in how they deliver? I think particularly aiming early on in the journey, so the early years and the primary schools, may be the way that we get better outcomes for what we've got. But I think it's very important that the NHS continues to provide the specialists that are needed to help children, be the best they can be.
So there is an aspiration to have additional speech and therapists qualifying, working for the NHS.
As you know, we have there's an existing long-term workforce plan which sees significant increases in the NHS workforce. Obviously, the government will be looking again at that as part of its 10-year plan and looking at what the future for NHS staff across the board is.
Does that include speech therapists then?
Yeah, the plan has the full range of services, so community health services are included.
So you'll be very glad to know, our witnesses, that this is the last question, but I think we probably haven't quite got to the bottom of this financial issue, this whole issue of SEND. So, Ms. Acland-Hood, last question from me. If I could take you to paragraph 2.35 on page 43. It says in there that DfE recognises that immediate action is needed to address short-term financial challenges given the statutory override. And it then goes on to say some 43% of authorities may therefore be at risk of needing to issue a Section 114 notice. I mean, this is the most serious thing that can happen to a local authority, declaring that forecast income does not meet its forecast spending next year. And that's a pretty serious paragraph. Can I ask what your department is doing about that?
So this comes back to the question earlier about the end of the statutory override,
Yes,
and we're working closely with MHCLG.
But I think it's a little bit
HMT.
sooner than that. I mean, it's saying by the end of next year. I presume that they probably are meaning 26. I don't know.
It's linked to that. So it says they might be needing to issue a Section 114 notice if the statutory override ends as planned in March 2026. So it's exactly the same issue.
Right.
So we're working very closely with HMT and MHCLG to look at the propositions, and we're continuing to do work through Safety Valve and DS and delivering better value in the meantime to work with those local authorities that have the largest deficits to seek to bring them down. And we are seeing those deficits come down in the authorities we're working with.
But nevertheless, an authority like mine, the reserves are gone, so they won't have the reserves, so their whole finances are being put at risk. I mean, this is the seriousness of this issue. Yes, go on then, Clive.
The safety valve, it's pretty opaque, isn't it, really? It looks like an excuse to try and put some money into an authority without really saying this is an overall approach to what the education needs of an area are.
I don't think that's quite right. I mean, what the safety valve does is take the local authorities with the largest deficits and create a plan with them for how they can manage that better by intervening earlier. And we see, and again, that's by agreement. It's an agreement that's reached with the authority. And we have seen in the majority of areas where we've got safety valve agreements, those deficits starting to come down.
But it's there for authorities which have got the deficits. Not ones that got particular education needs, but for ones that got the deficits. So it's skewed, isn't it? Driven by something which isn't purely educational.
Well, it's in addition to the funding that goes through the main formula, which is driven by population and by a set of proxy factors that look at need, and it's linked so it's not the only funding that's going into the system.
But it's addition to and isn't reflective of the assessments that are done as part of the main grant based on need and population.
It was a response to the fact that we had authorities with very large deficits and to precisely this problem that is being raised, which is, and again, I thought your analysis earlier was really exactly right and reflected the challenge of the problem, which is it's important both to be fair and to recognise that if you expected authorities that have ended up with significant deficits to absorb it, that would have an impact on the whole authority and the other services it was available to provide, but also that we need to try to be fair to those authorities that haven't worked up deficits or that have used surpluses, and that is a challenging problem. I mean, I think that what the safety valve does is it seeks to try to recognise, address and support those authorities that have run up large deficits, but not by allowing them to continue to do the things that cause the deficit, by trying to support them to shift to earlier intervention and to a more sustainable system. It has been very challenging, and it relates to the point about needing to take a more comprehensive look, because although we have been successful in supporting the majority of the safety valve authorities to start to bring down their deficits, the surrounding again, the list of limitations that I gave on the improvement plan have meant that it has been difficult, and we need to look at that whole, what is the whole system architecture and incentives that have given rise to that position in the first place, as well as trying to work that down with each individual local authority. So some of this is about how we address the statutory override with MHCLG and HMT, but some of the answer to this is in the bigger look at the whole system. I mean, fundamentally, the system doesn't give very many levers to a local authority once there is a plan with some need and a preferred provision specified in it. At the moment, the system doesn't give very many levers to look at cost at all.
Have you identified the levers that they need and agreed them?
So that's the work that I'm describing us doing with ministers. So I think we've identified some of them through the improvement plan, and I think there are more that we need to look at, including around accountability, including their levers with schools, and including things like curriculum change and other means that can support better inclusive provision. I would say we also need to look at the variation. So not all local authorities are in this place. And there are local authorities that are successfully delivering good quality provision without a deficit in the current system. And we need to look at what they're doing and spread that practice.
That would include the levers with regard to academies as well, would it?
It could potentially, and again, I mean, some of these are policy questions for ministers, which we need to talk to them about.
We're going to call a halt there and thank our witnesses, all of you, very much indeed. I think you've probably heard, Ms. Acland-Hood, that we are very concerned not only about the issue itself and the impact on children, but also the stability of the local government finances and the terrific strain. You say that some of them are delivering this, very small numbers are not getting themselves into financial trouble because of this issue. We will be watching this very carefully, and I would be grateful if you would keep us well updated with your discussions on the Treasury and with MHCLG and local authorities on this issue, because it is, I think, one of the issues that this committee is most concerned about. So in thanking you very much, it's been a long session, there's been a lot to cover, and I'm very grateful for all your work and answers. Thank you very much indeed. The committee is, whatever the correct word is, closed. Adjourned. Order. First time, you see, this is the problem.